Romantic Tales. Chapter 449. The Empress Dowager looked at Prime Minister Lu suspiciously. Prime Minister Lu just let her look at him calmly and sincerely. As an old fox who had been in the court all his life, how could he let others see through him when he really wanted to hide something? In the end, the Empress Dowager just waved the crowd away with annoyance. Seeing everyone leave, the mammy beside the Empress Dowager asked carefully, "Your Highness, what do you think about the Emperor?" The Empress Dowager closed her eyes to rest and said lightly, "I have already retired to the imperial harem. I don't have the time to care so much. The Empress and the courtiers will take care of these things. Where is Prince Li now?" The mammy whispered. After Prince Li and the Emperor agreed to stop the war, he promised to come back to the capital this year to celebrate the Empress Dowager's birthday. Prince Li should be on his way now. The Empress Dowager nodded. Very good. Send a message to Prince Li and ask him to come to the capital as soon as possible. In addition, the one Prince Li left in the capital, called Yi Ying, isn't she pregnant? The mammy nodded. You are right. Concubine Yi gave birth to a son for Prince Li. Now the child is almost 1 year old. Send someone to take care of her. The Empress Dowager ordered and waved her hand to let the mammy leave. Thinking of her 2 sons, the Empress Dowager's face darkened. Others said that she was lucky. In the former emperor's imperial harem, she was the only one who gave birth to 2 children. Her eldest son even became the emperor of a country, and she became the Empress Dowager because of her son. However, no one knew that her eldest son was suspicious by nature. Even his mother was on guard against her, fearing that she would threaten him with her power. If not, she could be the Empress Dowager peacefully. Why would she scheme against the emperor together with her youngest son? These years she seemed to be very honorable in the imperial harem, but in fact she was just good-looking. The emperor could contradict her from time to time for a favorite concubine. She could not get any power in the imperial harem. How could the Empress Dowager, who had been scheming against each other all her life and thought that she could live a smooth life from now on, be reconciled? After saying goodbye to concubine Lu, the empress returned to her palace. Her calm face showed a trace of worry and confusion. The empress waved her hand to let the mamas and maids behind her leave. Then she pushed the door open and walked into her bedroom. The empress walked into the room and looked at the quiet room in front of her. She walked to the table and sat down. Then she said faintly, "Come out." After a while, Feng Jiao walked out from behind the curtain of the phoenix bed and looked at her quietly. The empress frowned slightly, but Feng Jiao didn't wait for her to speak. He opened his mouth and said, "I came to take something, I'll leave immediately." The empress was startled. She didn't understand and asked, "Take what?" Feng Jiao said, "Mo Jingqi gave you a white jade box 8 years ago for safekeeping." The empress pondered for a moment, then raised her head to look at him and said, "Was it you who captured the emperor?" "Yes," Feng Jiao admitted. "Do you want to call someone to arrest me?" The empress stood up and walked quickly to him. "Kidnapping the ruler of a country? Aren't you a little too daring? Now that the capital and the imperial palace have been completely sealed off, let's see how you're going to deal with the aftermath." Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows and said with a faint smile, "If I can enter, then I can naturally leave. Not to mention, Mo Jingqi's life is still in my hands." The empress angrily glared at him. She shook her head and said, "After following Prince Ding for so many years, haven't you used your brain? Do you think that everyone really wants the emperor to come back safely? I'm afraid that there are many people who want you to kill him." "I really want to kill him," Feng Jiao said hatefully. "Nonsense." The empress reprimanded in a low voice. Kidnapping the emperor definitely wasn't Prince Ding's idea. "What did you come back to do this time?" Feng Jiao paused before saying, "I'm following Wang Fei's orders to take the blue jade falling flower." "Blue jade falling flower?" The empress frowned. She didn't know much about medicine, so naturally she didn't know what the blue jade falling flower was for. She looked at Feng Jiao in annoyance and said, "For Princess Ding to send you back, it must be something important. Can't I help you find it when you send someone to send a message? Are you only happy now that you've made such a big fuss?" Feng Jiao gave a light snort and said, "If we don't make such a big fuss, no one will be able to find it. Mo Jingqi places great importance on the blue jade falling flower. All these years, even the person who gave it to him and his most trusted concubine Lu didn't know about it. Why would he tell you? Not to mention that if he found out that you were searching for the blue jade falling flower, you wouldn't be able to escape responsibility. The Empress gave a helpless sigh and asked, so you already know where the blue jade falling flower is? Feng Xiao nodded. Jingqi said that he gave it to you half a year ago. Do you still remember a white jade box? The Empress lowered her head in thought for a moment. She nodded and said, I remember now. Wait a moment. She turned and walked into the room. Not long after, the Empress came out holding a beautifully carved white jade box. She put the white jade box into Feng Xiao's hands and asked, is this? Feng Xiao took the box and carefully opened it. Inside there was a light green flower that looked like a peony. It looked like jade, but when one reached out to touch the flower petals, they could clearly feel its softness and a faint strange fragrance. This flower had been picked for a long time, but it didn't show any signs of withering. It was like a jade flower. Feng Xiao compared the general appearance and color of the blue jade falling flower that Mr. Chen had told him. He concluded that the white jade box in front of him really did contain the legendary blue jade falling flower. The Empress said in a low voice, take it away. Release the Emperor as soon as possible and then return to the northwest. Feng Xiao put away the box and looked deeply at the Empress. He said, you really want to stay in the palace forever? The Empress gave a faint smile and said, if I don't stay in the palace forever, where can I go? Go quickly and be careful. Feng Xiao stared at her. You're not afraid that I'll kill Jingqi? The Empress shook her head and gave a faint smile. You won't do that. If the Emperor dies now, it won't be good for the Prince Ding mansion. Even though no one has said anything yet, there must be a lot of people in the court who suspect the Prince Ding mansion. If the Emperor really doesn't come back, it doesn't matter if the Prince Ding mansion did it or not. In the end, those people will still push the blame onto Prince Ding. Feng Xiao gave a dissatisfied grunt, but he couldn't deny that what the Empress said was true. He turned and said, I'm leaving. The Empress nodded, be careful on the way. Feng Xiao walked a few steps and then turned back with a smile. Do you know what your Emperor did? He wants to destroy the Su family. The Empress froze. When she came back to her senses, Feng Xiao had already disappeared. She could only sigh softly and a bitter smile appeared on her beautiful face. With Mu Qingsong secretly escorting them, Feng Xiao was also an expert. Even though the palace was heavily guarded, they still walked out without any danger. The two returned to the place where they hid Jingqi. Leng Haoyu was sitting in the room staring at Jingqi while waiting for news. Seeing them come in, Leng Haoyu quickly got up and asked, did you get the thing? Feng Xiao raised the box in his hand and said, I got it, but whether it's real or not, the Emperor has to personally confirm it. Chapter 450. Jingqi's face was gloomy as he said, you've already taken the item, what else do you want? Feng Xiao smiled and said, I'm a very suspicious person. I heard that this jade falling flower is not only a miraculous elixir, but also a miraculous medicine for treating injuries. Just a little bit of it can immediately heal a wound. I wonder if that's true? Jingqi was stunned. He stared closely at the dagger in Feng Xiao's hand and said, what do you want to do? Feng Xiao revealed a malicious smile at him and said, of course it's to ask your majesty to try the effects of this jade falling flower. We spent so much effort to get this item. If it turns out to be a fake, wouldn't we become a laughingstock? Jingqi gritted his teeth and said, we guarantee that it's true. Feng Xiao shook his head and said, your majesty's guarantee is worthless. The subordinate did not hesitate to stab Jingqi's shoulder with the dagger. Jingqi let out a blood-curdling scream and blood immediately flowed out. Feng Xiao's eyes flashed with a trace of pleasure. He happily used the dagger to gesture at the jade falling flower in the white jade box and said, how do we use this? It's said that it's a powder that needs to be scraped off with a knife. Such a beautiful flower is worthless if it's scraped off. Just try scraping off the bottom. Jingqi quickly said, you can't use a dagger. The jade falling flower must be preserved in a jade box to not lose its medicinal properties. Similarly, it must be cut with a jade knife. Oh, thank you for your advice. Feng Xiao flipped his hand and put away the dagger. He also put the jade falling flower back into the box and said to Leng Haoyu, do you have any golden sore medicine? Give him some. Leng Haoyu raised his eyebrows. He silently took out the golden sore medicine and casually sprinkled some on Jingqi's wound. Jingqi's face was pale from the pain. He glared fiercely at Feng Xiao and said, we definitely won't let you off. Feng Jiao sneered. If you have the time to threaten us, you might as well think about how you're going to return to the capital. As far as I know, there are a lot of people who don't go back like you. It was said that the Empress Dowager had already sent a message to Prince Li, asking him to hurry to the capital. It seems that our emperor is also someone who is not loved by his parents. Emo Jingqi was hit where it hurt, but he couldn't do anything about it. Feng Jiao had no interest in paying attention to Emo Jingqi's feelings. He put away the Biluo flower in satisfaction and raised his chin towards Leng Haoyu. I'll leave him to you. There's no need to send them back in a hurry lest we cause trouble before we leave. Leng Haoyu smiled and said, Are you worried about me? Go about your business. Feng Jiao nodded. He glanced at Emo Jingqi and said with a smile, Seeing that the emperor is so cooperative, how about I give you a piece of information for free? Emo Jingqi looked at him coldly, clearly not believing that he would be kind enough to give him any information. Feng Jiao didn't mind and said with a smile, It's information about the emperor's trusted aide, Lord Tan. It is said that Lord Tan's surname is Lin and his name is Yuan. He is the descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Your Majesty, can you guess what Lin Yuan's Yuan is? It can't be that he wishes for the emperor's longevity and unparalleled fortune, right? After saying this, Feng Jiao laughed loudly and turned to leave, leaving behind Emo Jingqi whose face was green and white. Feng Jiao took the Biluo flower and went to the place Su Zuidi had told him before she died to retrieve the imperial edict left behind by Emperor Taizu. Then he silently disappeared from the capital. Other than those close to him, outsiders didn't even know that Feng Jiao had returned to the capital. Leng Haoyu didn't stand on ceremony and locked Emo Jingqi in a small dark room for 3 whole days. On the 4th day, when he heard that Prince Li was about to enter the capital, he ordered someone to cover the unconscious Emo Jingqi in a cloth bag and threw him out of the city gates while it was still stuffy in the morning. From beginning to end, Emo Jingqi didn't even know where he was tied up. Whether it was Feng Jiao, Leng Haoyu or Mu Qingtsong, Emo Jingqi clearly couldn't remember them. So this time he suffered a loss for nothing. Under everyone's strange gazes, Emo Jingqi angrily returned to the palace. He didn't care about the concubines and courtiers who came to greet him and angrily issued several imperial edicts. First, arrest the rebels who dared to kidnap him regardless of whether they died or were injured. Instead, thoroughly investigate all the courtiers who were close to Tan Jiji, as well as Tan Jiji's movements over the years, and arrest Tan Jiji. Third, search the capital's imperial censor manor, the Su family, Yunzhou's Su family, and Mount Li. Immediately lock up imperial censor Su's family and throw them into prison. The first 2 imperial edicts were reasonable, but the third one poked a hornet's nest. Prime Minister Lu took the imperial edict and just walked out of the palace gates with the officials and guards who searched the family, only to see the palace gates in an uproar. Hundreds of scholars knelt on the ground and cried out for the Su family in unison. Prime Minister Lu looked around and found that there were many people who were already officials in the imperial court. Prime Minister Lu knew that the Su family was the head of the scholars in the world, but he didn't expect that they would be so popular. The emperor's edict was issued less than an hour ago, and so many people were kneeling in front of the gate. If a few more hours passed, who knew what would happen? He couldn't help but feel jealous and resentful. Unfolding the imperial edict in his hand, Prime Minister Lu read it at the gate of the palace. However, the emperor's golden rule couldn't make these scholars bury it, and they all refuted it. In fact, it was not that these scholars were fickle, but that the emperor's edict was really difficult to convince the public. It didn't clearly state what the Su family had done, nor did it say who had done it. Originally, it didn't matter whether the emperor's edict could convince the public, because not many people dared to issue the emperor's edict. But the bad thing was that the Su family's influence was too great. The Su family had produced many great scholars in the past generations. Although they couldn't be called great teachers, they could be said to be the teachers of most scholars since the founding of the Chu state. However, scholars were a kind of very strange people. They seemed to be very weak and couldn't be lifted or carried, but sometimes the pride in their bones was surprisingly strong and stubborn. Seeing so many people kneeling in front of the palace gates, Prime Minister Lu knew that things were going to go wrong. The guards behind Prime Minister Lu also couldn't do anything. Of course, it was easy for them to deal with these scholars with their skills, but these people were not people they could casually deal with. Without the emperor's golden rule, who dared to touch so many scholars? At that time half of the sky of Dechu state would be turned upside down. Looking at the people kneeling and kowtowing, Prime Minister Lu had no choice but to send people back to the palace to report to the emperor. Hearing the guard's report, Mo Jingqi was so angry that he almost fainted. Ignoring the injury on his shoulder, he hurried to the palace gates with noble consort Lu. People in the world were divided into scholars, farmers, businessmen, and scholars were the first. To put it bluntly, the country was governed by these scholars. If something happened to this group of people, the country wouldn't be far from being destroyed. When Mo Jingqi arrived at the palace gates, it was only half an hour, but the people at the palace gates had more than doubled from the hundreds just now, and it seemed that more people were joining in. Seeing the emperor come out, the people kneeling in front of him became more excited. They all shouted, asking the emperor to be merciful, asking the emperor to judge clearly, saying that the Su family was wronged and so on. Mo Jingqi's weak body, which had been frightened these days, was now dizzy. Chapter 451. What is going on? Mo Jingqi demanded angrily. A young man kneeling at the front of the group said in a loud voice, "Since the founding of Great Chu, the Su clan has served Great Chu loyally, and the ancestors of Su clan have taught and educated the people, and have done their best to cultivate talents for Great Chu. May I ask your majesty, what crime did the Su family commit to have their entire family confiscated?" Mo Jingqi choked, the anger in his heart growing. The Su family plotted rebellion and their crimes are punishable by death. As citizens of Dechu state, you actually dare to plead for mercy for these traitors? Another person in the crowd raised his head. Where is the evidence of the Su family's rebellion? Please instruct us, your majesty. Hearing this, the people kneeling at the palace gates all shouted, "Please instruct us, your majesty." Their meaning was clear. If the emperor could really produce evidence of the Su family's rebellion, then they would have nothing to say. What evidence did Mo Jingqi have? Even at the start he did not accuse the Su family of rebellion. However, after the disturbance caused by these scholars, Mo Jingqi's anger soared. How could he care about anything else? He could only pin the most serious crime on the Su family. Furthermore, if the Su family was said to have colluded with Prince Ding, the Prince Ding mansion's reputation among the people was not inferior to the Su family's. When the time came, there would only be trouble. Impudent! All of you quickly retreat. We will forgive your sins. Mo Jingqi said. The Su family is innocent, your majesty, please judge clearly. These people dared to beg for mercy at the palace gates. How could they be dismissed with just a few words from Mo Jingqi? The palace gates were in an uproar. Even many commoners had heard the news and came over, surrounding the palace gates so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. As a result, it was even harder to take action. Your majesty, what crime did the Su family commit? Does your majesty want to confiscate the Su family? Just as they were making a ruckus, a loud voice suddenly rang out, and the crowd parted to make a path. The white-haired old Duke Hua led a group of people and walked forward in a grandiose manner. Mo Jingqi's face was as black as ink. He stared at the majestic old Duke Hua, cursing in his heart. Duke Hua stepped forward, lifted the hem of his robes and knelt on the ground. The Su family is loyal and righteous, and Mr. Qingyun's name has spread far and wide. What crime has Su Shi committed to make your majesty so angry? Would your majesty please explain? Following behind him were some of the top officials in the court. There were even some members of the imperial clan and some old ministers of the former emperor who had been idle at home. They were all people who had a good relationship with Mr. Qingyun and the Su family. Before the Empress Dowager spoke, the Empress came to the front, knelt on the ground and said in a low voice, "The Su family of Yunzhou is loyal to the Dechu state. Your Majesty, please reconsider." There were several concubines beside the Empress. Although they were not favored, they were virtuous women from scholarly families. They also knelt down and said in unison, "Your Majesty, please reconsider." Mo Jingqi's face darkened. Before he said anything, Great Elder Princess Fu Shi and Great Elder Princess Zhaoyang had come to the front. Great Elder Princess pushed away the palace maid who was supporting her, knelt down beside the Empress and said, "What crime did the Su family commit? Your Majesty, why do you want to confiscate the Su family? Your Majesty, please tell us." Great Elder Princess Zhaoyang didn't say anything, but directly knelt beside Great Elder Princess. It was obvious that what Great Elder Princess said was what she wanted to say. Emo Jingqi was almost trembling with anger. But Great Elder Princess Fu, she was a senior, so he couldn't let her kneel at the gate of the palace. He hurriedly asked the palace maid beside him to help her up and said, "Your Majesty, let's go back to the palace and talk about it." Why did you come back to the capital city?" Great Elder Princess didn't appreciate his kindness and said lightly, "I'm old and useless, so I don't dare to expect your Majesty to listen to the advice of old people like us. But the Su family has really made great contributions to the Dechu state. Not to mention that they didn't do anything wrong. Even if they did, your Majesty should punish them lightly. Although I'm old and muddle-headed, I still want to beg your Majesty. Please investigate the Su family clearly." Great Elder Princess's words made Emo Jingqi so angry that he almost fainted, but he was still speechless. Looking at the increasing number of scholars, officials, and even ordinary people gathering in front of the palace gate, Emo Jingqi only felt that he was going to faint, and he was afraid that today's matter would be difficult to be settled. Emo Jingli, who was standing beside him, was in a surprisingly good mood. At that time he took the risk of rebelling. Although he only lived in most of the regions south of the Yangtze River temporarily, he was much better than before. It was said that Emo Jingli was the younger brother of the current emperor, who was doted on and respected by the emperor. But with his emperor brother's temperament, how could he really give him power? In the capital city he was just a little better looking than other princes. But now he occupied the prosperous regions south of the Yangtze River. Even if his emperor brother was furious, he couldn't do anything to him. Speaking of which, Emo Shuyao did him a big favor. If it weren't for the fact that Emo Shuyao now occupied the northwest and made his emperor brother extremely afraid, he couldn't return to the capital city so openly. At this time, seeing Emo Jingqi's angry face, Emo Jingli didn't show it on his face, but he was very happy in his heart. If the emperor really did confiscate the Su family, he was afraid that the Dechu state would really fall into chaos. Emo Jingqi was stunned for a moment before an idea flashed through his mind. He shouted, "Stop the Empress!" Everyone was stunned, but they saw that the Empress did not move at all. She just stood there and looked at the Emperor helplessly. The Empress sighed faintly in her heart. Did the Emperor think that she was also going to die to persuade him? As the Empress, she was also the Emperor's wife. How could she let the Emperor bear the crime of forcing his wife and the Empress to death? Emo Jingqi stared at the Empress in a daze and his face turned pale. On the other side, Great Elder Princess was not so polite. She said coldly, "Since your Majesty said so, please lock me up as well. I am willing to share the same crime as Su." With Great Elder Princess taking the lead, the people behind also shouted, "We are willing to share the same crime as Su." In an attic not far from the palace gate, the half-closed window could see the scene at the palace gate in the distance. But the people outside could not see the people inside. The noise outside the palace gate naturally spread into the attic. By the window, Leng Haoyu held a wine cup and leaned against the window lazily to drink. The man sitting opposite him was dressed in white, handsome and elegant. His eyebrows were slightly raised and only bloomed with a pure lotus-like elegance, like an immortal. Who else could it be but Su Qingchen? When Su Qingchen knew that Yili had returned safely and was pregnant, he knew that there would be an accident in the future, and the Su family could not easily get out of it. Therefore he rushed to Yunzhou as soon as possible after dealing with the affairs in the south. After returning to Yunzhou, he had a deep talk with his grandfather and father and then rushed to the capital. He happened to see such a good show. Leng Haoyu looked at young Master Qingchen, and there was a little more appreciation in his eyes. In Leng Haoyu's opinion, among the 5 young masters of the Su family, only young Master Qingchen was the most similar to the princess. Usually he was amiable and gentle to others, but when it was time to fight he was fierce and never soft-hearted. In such a situation, what do you think Emo Jingqi will do? Leng Haoyu was a martial artist and his eyesight was naturally better than ordinary people. He clearly saw Emo Jingqi's expression and face outside the palace gate. Su Qingchen on the opposite side only held a cup of tea, looked leisurely and calm and said with a faint smile, "Emo Jingqi is cruel and merciless, but he lacks courage. No matter who set up the trap today, he can't solve it. If he killed a few people in the beginning, the people behind him would naturally stop. If he didn't hesitate to kill Emo Jingli, how could Prince Li have the power today? 10 years ago, if he didn't hesitate to kill Prince Ding, how could there be today's situation? With such a temperament, even in peaceful times he can't be called a monarch, let alone now that chaos is coming. He can only be played in the hands of others. Lung Haoyu's heart was slightly cold, and he looked at the handsome man in front of him in awe. Young Master Qingqian's talent was well known in the world and he was famous for being extraordinary, but he didn't expect to say such sarcastic and sharp words. Nodding in agreement with Su Qingqian's point of view, Lung Haoyu turned his gaze to the city gate again. His eyes lit up and he said with a smile, "The good show is coming." The palace gate was in a deadlock when a clear and steady voice came from not far away. "This subject Su Hongyan greets the emperor." Everyone turned their heads and saw that Su Hongyan wasn't wearing his official robe, but a white cloth robe as he strode over. 2 steps behind him was Su Qingbai, who was also dressed in cloth robes. Seeing him, many people called out, "Lord Su is here." Although Su Hongyan's reputation wasn't as good as his father and brothers, he was still a famous talent in Dechu State. It was just that he was trapped in the capital when he was young, and he was an imperial censor without any real power. Naturally, he wasn't as good as his father and brother who taught students in Yunzhou. Su Hongyan walked to the palace gate and bowed respectfully to Mo Jingqi and the others, saying, "This subject Su Hongyan greets the Emperor, Empress Dowager and Empress Dowager." Su Qingbai followed behind and bowed. The Sunshine eldest princess frowned and said, "Lord Su, why are you here?" Su Hongyan smiled faintly and said, "Reporting to the princess because of the Su family's matter. How could this subject not know about it? I've troubled the princess and everyone to plead leniency for the Su family. Hongyan has written here." Looking at the old man's corpse at the foot of the palace wall, Su Hongyan let out a long sigh, the corners of his eyes red. He bowed deeply to the old man's corpse and said, "The Su family has received Elder Li's great kindness, and there's nothing we can do to repay it." After doing this, Su Hongyan turned to the people kneeling behind him and said, "Many thanks to everyone for pleading on behalf of the Su family, but this is the Su family's family matter and we shouldn't implicate everyone because of the Su family's mistake. Please return. Su Hongyan is here respectfully awaiting your majesty's decree." Su Qingbai, who was kneeling beside him, also said, "The Su family's 4th son Su Qingbai is here." Chapter 453. Mo Jingqi sneered, stared at them and said, "So you too plead guilty?" Su Qingbai smiled faintly and said, "If the emperor wants me to die, I should die. His Majesty wants to exterminate the Su family. How dare the Su family not respect him? But what crime do you want us to plead guilty to, your Majesty?" Su Qingbai and Su Hongyan's behavior left a better impression on the people present, and at the same time, they were more dissatisfied with the emperor. Mo Jingqi obviously felt that the ministers and relatives kneeling on the ground were dissatisfied with him. If he didn't act like this, something bad might happen today. He closed his eyes, suppressed the anger in his heart and said, "Send Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai back to the censor's mansion. Without my order, no one is allowed to see them." After that, he turned around and walked into the palace gate, ignoring the reactions of the crowd. Mo Jingqi seemed to leave in anger, but in fact he had suffered a lot these days. In addition, he was very angry today. If he didn't leave now, he might not be able to hold on. Prime Minister Lu, who was standing aside, waved his hand and asked people to take Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai back to the censor's mansion. Although the Su family was not exterminated today, it was inevitable that the Su family would fall out with the imperial court, and the Lu family would become the first aristocratic family in Dechu State soon. Su Hongyan and Su Qingbai thanked the people kneeling on the ground again before they were taken away. The people in front of the palace gate also dispersed. Seeing this scene, Mo Jingli smiled thoughtfully and followed the Empress Dowager into the palace. Zhaoyang Princess looked at the palace gate that gradually quieted down and sighed helplessly. She looked at Great Elder Princess beside her and said, "Imperial Aunt?" Great Elder Princess shook her head and her old face looked a little tired. She held Zhaoyang Princess's hand and said, "His Majesty is confused." "Well, Zhaoyang, stay with me for a few days." Zhaoyang Princess said with a smile, "There are few people in Zhaoyang Mansion. I'm glad that you don't mind." She helped Zhaoyang Princess into the carriage, and then the 2 carriages went out of the city one after another. Lung Haoyu, who was sitting upstairs and watching the show, chuckled and said, "Young Master Qingqian is wise. Lord Su leaving like this is much better than leaving directly before. Not only did this strike a blow to Mo Jingqi, it also didn't damage the Su family's reputation. Now it was the royal family who had let down the Su family, not the Su family who had let down the royal family. Su Qingchen stood up and glanced at the empty palace gate. She smiled faintly and said, I just need to put on one more show and I can leave the capital. Leng Haoyu said, how did young Master Qingchen know that Mo Jingqi would make a move? What if he doesn't make a move? Do we have to put on a show ourselves? Su Qingchen lowered his head and sipped his tea. He smiled and said, there's no need. Even if Mo Jingqi doesn't make a move, someone else will. On the other hand, Mo Jingqi naturally flew into a rage when he returned to the palace. In front of everyone in the palace, he mercilessly reprimanded the concubines who had knelt and begged with the empress. Just as he was about to banish them to the cold palace, he heard the empress step forward and say, today's matter was started by Qinxia. If your majesty wants to punish Qinxia, then punish Qinxia as well. Mo Jingqi was angry. He had always been on guard against this empress and didn't dote on her. However, she was still the wife bestowed to him by his imperial father. Before he ascended the throne, they had supported each other for a period of time. Therefore he had always given her enough respect. Hearing the empress say this, Mo Jingqi sneered and said, you still know that you are Jin's empress? You want to embarrass Jin in front of all the people in the capital? The empress lowered her eyes and calmly said, the Su family can't be compared to other families. They are closely related to the Dechu state. If the Su family really has the intention to rebel, Qinxia won't dare to object to any of your majesty's decisions. But your majesty, does the Su family have such intentions? Mo Jingqi choked. Facing the empress' calm and bright eyes, he couldn't say anything. After a long time he angrily waved his hand and said, everyone else scram. As for the empress, stay in your palace and don't come out. Leave the matters of the inner palace to concubine Lu. The empress didn't object. She stood and said, many thanks to your majesty. Qinxia will leave. My sisters, come with I. The concubines naturally wanted this. Today they had volunteered to follow the empress to ask for the Su family's life. Just now the empress had saved them, so they were even more grateful to the empress. They weren't favored in the palace to begin with, so they naturally didn't have any expectations for the emperor. Watching the empress leave with her people, Mo Jingqi waved his hand and smashed an antique porcelain on the table to pieces. An eunuch reported from outside the door, reporting to your majesty, Li Wang requests an audience. Tell him to scram. Mo Jingqi angrily roared. Concubine Lu stood beside him and coldly looked at his mad appearance. A trace of disdain flashed through her eyes. 3 days after the incident at the palace gates, late at night, the imperial censor's mansion suddenly caught on fire. Then there was the sound of fighting. By the time the guards of the yamen and people in the inner city who had a good relationship with the Su family arrived, the entire imperial censor's mansion was already in ruins. When people rushed into the imperial censor's mansion, they only found 1 or 2 servants who were lucky enough to survive. The rest of the people had turned into charred corpses that had been burned by the fire. It was impossible to tell who was the Su family and who was the assassins. However, someone at the scene accidentally stepped on half of a burnt palace guard's token. Although the imperial censor's mansion was quickly taken over by people sent by the palace and all the unrelated people were driven out, some news still secretly spread. The entire capital fell into an even more strange and dignified atmosphere. 20 li outside of the capital city, on a secluded and deserted path, Leng Haoyu cupped his hands and smiled. Lord Su, young Master Qingchen, 4th young master, take care of yourselves. 2 simple and inconspicuous carriages stopped by the side of the road. Su Qingchen sat in the carriage and said to Leng Haoyu with a faint smile, this time I've troubled young Master Leng. Take care. Leng Haoyu smiled and said, it's my duty to work for the prince. There will be Shadow Guard and Qi Lin secretly protecting you all along the way. You don't have to worry about your safety. As for the servants of the imperial censor's mansion, I'll also make arrangements. Please rest assured, Lord Su. Su Hongyan nodded and said, thank you for your trouble, young Master Leng. I'll take my leave now. Everyone take care. Leng Haoyu nodded with a smile and stepped aside. The carriage slowly moved forward. In the carriage behind sat Madame Su. However, beside Madame Su was not her original maid, but the young miss of the Qin family, Qin Zheng. Like Madame Su, Qin Jing was only wearing ordinary cotton clothes, but she was already beautiful and moving. However, she grabbed the corner of Madame Su's clothes with one hand. Obviously, she was a little uneasy about leaving home for the first time. Madame Su patted the back of her hand lovingly and said with a smile, "Jing-er, it's been hard on you. In the future, Auntie will definitely let Zhe-er hold a grand wedding for you." Qin Zheng's pretty face was slightly red and she whispered, "Since Zheng-er is engaged to the second young master, how can I feel wronged?" Madame Su saw this and became more and more affectionate. She smiled lovingly and said, "Good child, if that child Qingzi dares to bully you, mother will definitely stand up for you." Auntie. At the beginning of September, the imperial censor's mansion was attacked by assassins and the entire mansion turned into a sea of fire. 10 days later, the young miss of the Qin family, Qin Jing, who was engaged to the second young master of the Su family since childhood, fell ill and died in less than half a month. Chapter 454. Although Mo Jingqi had forcefully suppressed the discussion of the murder case in the Su manor, how could such a thing be suppressed? Within a few days, the news that the emperor had sent people to assassinate the Su family and set it on fire had spread throughout the capital and the Dechu state. At the same time, Master Qin Yun announced at Lishan Academy that because the emperor had killed the Su family for no reason, the Su family would move to the northwest to seek refuge. Lishan Academy would continue to open in the northwest. The students who did not move to the northwest could choose to study at other schools in Dechu state. Those who wished to continue studying at Lishan Academy could also study in the northwest. By the time the imperial court sent people to Yunzhou, the entire Yunzhou Su family had already left, leaving only an empty academy on Lishan Academy. When Mo Jingqi received the news, he was furious. He ordered people to set fire to Lishan Academy and announced to the world that the Su family had colluded with Prince Ding to rebel. He ordered all the prefectures in the northwest to arrest them. However, the Su family was protected by the shadow guard that Mo Shuyao had specially sent to protect them. They did not enter the city at all. The various government offices were intimidated by Prince Ding's power and did not dare to make things difficult for the Su family. Unexpectedly, the Su family safely left Feihong Pass and headed to Riyang. At the city gates of Riyang, Yili and Mo Shuyao stood hand in hand outside the city gates. They looked at the carriages that were gradually approaching and revealed happy smiles. "They're here." Although they had been waiting for the news from the shadow guard, they were still worried when they did not see them arrive safely in Riyang. At this moment, when she saw the fleet, Yili felt that her heart, which had been hanging in the air for the past few days, was finally at ease. Mo Shuyao looked at her with a smile. "I told you it was fine, but you were so worried that you almost scared Feng San, Qin Feng and the others. If the people below saw that Princess Ding, who would not change her expression even if Mount Tai collapsed, was still so worried, who knows how many people would be scared." Yili also smiled a little embarrassedly. She was flustered because it had nothing to do with her. How could she not be worried when she thought that this matter concerned the entire Su family? Before the carriage reached the city gates, Yili let go of Mo Shuyao and went forward to welcome them. The one driving the carriage at the front was the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion. Seeing the people approaching, he immediately stopped the carriage and turned his head to say, "The prince and Wang Fei have come to welcome Mr. Qingyun." The door of the first carriage opened and Su Hongyu came out first. Together with the shadow guard who was driving the carriage, they helped a white-haired old man out of the carriage. Yili stood in front of the carriage and looked at the familiar yet strange old man in front of her. She only felt her eyes redden and tears unconsciously fell. The old man in front of him looked thin and distant. He had a head of white hair, but he didn't look old at all. Instead, his eyes were full of spirit. Seeing Yili standing in front of the carriage, the old man showed a hint of nostalgia and affection on his face. He seemed even more amiable and otherworldly, like a celestial being. "Li." Mo Shuyao walked forward and saw Yili staring dazedly at Mr. Qingyun with tears in her eyes. His heart ached slightly. He smiled helplessly and said, "Mr. Qingyun has arrived. Why are you crying?" Yili found that her face was covered in tears. Long before her mother had passed away, her maternal grandfather had returned to Yunzhou. In between, Yili had recovered the memories of her previous life. She appeared to have not seen her maternal grandfather for many years. Now that she suddenly saw him, the scene of her maternal grandfather holding her on his knees as he read to her as a child flooded her mind. She actually unconsciously cried. Maternal grandfather. Yili greets maternal grandfather. When Yili knelt, Emo Xiuyao didn't hesitate. He lifted his clothes and knelt on the ground with Yili. Mr. Qiyun hurriedly pulled the two up and said, "Prince, you can't do this." Emo Xiuyao smiled faintly and said, "Mr. Qiyun is Li Li's maternal grandfather. Naturally I should pay my respects." Mr. Qiyun looked at Emo Xiuyao's young head of white hair that was even whiter than his 70-year-old self. He couldn't help but sigh. He looked at Yili and smiled with gratification. "Good child, after not seeing you for so many years, maternal grandfather almost thought that he would never see you again. It is a blessing that we can meet again in this life. Why are you crying?" Yili hurriedly wiped away her tears and said with a smile, "Li forgot herself. Maternal grandfather and uncles are all here. How can I cry when our family is reunited? Maternal grandfather, uncles and aunts have suffered along the way." In the carriage behind them, Su Qingchen supported eldest Madame Su. Qin Zheng supported second Madame Su as they walked down. Behind them was Su Hongyan. Su Qingbai couldn't help but smile when they saw this scene. Before he could say anything, a cheer came from the city gate. Su Qingyan had already rushed out like a gust of wind. Before he arrived, his voice had already reached them. "Grandfather, father, mother, you're finally here. Your son missed you so much." Humph. Seeing his youngest son's jubilant face, Su Hongyu lightly snorted. Su Qingyan immediately became listless. He pitifully leaned against Su Qingbai and softly called out, "Fourth brother." Su Qingbai wordlessly reached out and patted his head. Su Qingyan glanced at his father who was still staring at him and hid behind Su Qingbai even more. Seeing him like this, Su Hongyu became angry. He narrowed his eyes and opened his mouth to scold him. Sir Qingyan looked at his youngest grandson who saw his father like a mouse seeing a cat and said with a smile, "Forget it. If there's anything we'll talk about it later." Su Hongyu naturally wouldn't go against his father's wishes. He respectfully nodded and said, "Father is right." Li greets eldest aunt and second aunt. Yili then stepped forward to greet the two Su madams. She also smiled and greeted Su Qingchen and the others. Eldest brother, third brother, sister Zheng'er. Seeing Qin Zheng's arrival, Yili was even happier. She turned back to look at Su Qingfeng and Su Qingze who were walking quickly behind her. Eldest Madame Su took Yili and looked her up and down. She smiled and said, "When we left the capital, Li was still a little girl. Now you have a child of your own. In the blink of an eye, so many years have passed." Yili smiled faintly and said, "Indeed, so many years have passed. My two aunts must be tired from the journey. Let's go back to the city and rest first." Knowing that Sir Qingyun liked peace and quiet, Emo Xiuyao and Qin Jing didn't arrange for many people to come and greet them. Only the two of them brought Su Qingfeng and the others to greet them at the city gate. When the group returned to the Prince Ding mansion, Steward Emo led everyone to greet them. The mansion had already prepared the courtyard and toiletries. They were only waiting for everyone to freshen up and rest. In the evening, they would invite the officials and generals of Riyang City to welcome the Su family. Su Qingbai smiled at Yili and said, "Li Biaomei, there's no need to rush. We're all anxious to see our little nephew." Yili smiled and turned back to order Qingwan, "Quickly go and ask the wet nurse to bring the baby over." Qingwan left with a smile. Yili personally helped Sir Qingyun to sit at the head seat and personally served tea. Everyone took their seats. Su Qingze and the other two bowed to their grandfather and parents again. Sir Qingyun looked at his children and grandchildren and the smile on his face became more affectionate. Although they had left Yunzhou where the Su family had lived for several generations, it was still a very happy thing to be able to reunite with the family. Looking at Su Qingfeng, he smiled and said, "Feng, I haven't seen you for several years. You look a lot more spirited." Compared to the other four young masters of the Su family, Su Qingfeng was considered an anomaly in the Su family. It wasn't that he didn't know how to read, but he didn't love those things that were insignificant. The Su family wouldn't look down on their children and grandchildren, but they weren't that comfortable. Now it seemed that Su Qingfeng was showing off his ability and was bursting with heroism. Seeing his grandson like this, Sir Qingyun was very pleased. Chapter 455. Su Qingfeng smiled and said, "Grandfather is right. Grandson has learned a lot in Sister Li's army. This is all thanks to Sister Li." Everyone looked at Yili in surprise. Yili quickly waved her hand and smiled. This is all third brother's own ability. I didn't help much. This was the truth. After throwing Su Qingfeng into Qilin, Yili didn't ask any more questions. This wasn't only because she wanted to give Qingfeng absolute trust and power. It was also for Su Qingfeng's own good. In a place like Qilin, if one still had to rely on connections, then it was better not to go. Otherwise one wouldn't even know how one died. Fortunately, Su Qingfeng also had a stubborn temper. Compared to the other elites of the Mahist army, Su Qingfeng, who came from a normal army camp, didn't have an advantage. However, he gritted his teeth and persevered without a word. Even Qingfeng praised him. We were shocked when we heard that Li Er led the army to beat back the hundreds of thousands of Xiling soldiers. It seems that our Su family is going to have a female general. Second Madame Ao was more familiar with Yili and didn't have any scruples when she joked. Yili smiled helplessly and said, Second aunt, you're also teasing Li. How am I a general? Mo Xiuyao looked at Yili with a smile and said, Li Er is indeed not a general. However, Li Er is more powerful than a general. Hearing this, everyone laughed again. Little Shitzi is here. Mother Lin walked in with the baby in her arms. It was rare that the baby was still awake. Yili stood up and carried the baby. Seeing the baby's white and tender face, she was very happy. Turning around, he carried the baby to Master Qingyun and said with a smile, Grandfather, look at the baby. Master Qingyun also had 5 grandchildren, so he was no stranger to carrying a baby. Reaching out to take the child in his arms, he carefully looked at him, then looked at Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao and said, This child looks more like Li Er. Mo Xiuyao smiled and nodded, but in his heart he did not agree. Those who had seen Mo Xiuyao and those who were close to him all said that he looked like Mo Xiuyao. Those who were close to Yi Li all said that he looked like Yi Li. However, Mo Xiuyao did not care who this little brat resembled. Yi Li smiled as she looked at Mo Xiuyao. She knew what he was thinking, but she didn't point it out. Since Mr. Qingyun was holding the child, the others were too embarrassed to rush to see it. However, they couldn't help but glance over. Even Su Hongyu, who had been sitting still recently, turned to look at the child in Mr. Qingyun's arms. With so many pairs of eyes staring at him, how could Mr. Qingyun not feel it? He smiled and handed the baby to Su Hongyu and said, Look, this child looks good. Once the child was in Su Hongyu's hands, the others did not have so many worries. Su Qingyan directly pulled Su Qingbai over to look. Although he had seen the baby before, Mo Xiaobao was getting cuter and cuter. He changed his appearance every day and could not get enough of looking at him. Su Qingchen also stood up and walked behind her father to look at the baby in his arms. It was Madame Su who said, How can the child be comfortable with so many people surrounding him? Master also doesn't know how to hold a child. Let me hold him. So the baby went from Su Hongyu's hands to Madame Su. Then the onlookers became second Madame Su and Qin Zheng. Mo Xiaobao was passed around in everyone's hands. He did not cry. Madame Su was surprised and said, This child is so obedient. Even Qingze, who was the least noisy in our family, was not so obedient. Mo Xiuyao's mouth twitched slightly. He stared at the red ball in Madame Su's hands with disdain. Obedient? Who was the kid who cried every night and insisted on being held by Li? Su Hongyu smiled and said, What's the child's name? Su Qingyan answered first, Mo Xiaobao. Su Hongyu was stunned and his mouth twitched. What kind of name was this? Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled, I haven't had time to give him a name. I was waiting for grandfather to come and give him a name. I just gave him a nickname. Could she tell her grandfather and uncle that the baby's father's tendency to name him was to embarrass the baby when he grew up? Mr. Qingyan was stunned for a moment, but he was very happy about it. He bowed his head and thought for a moment, in that case how about, You had the meaning of commanding and commanding. Qin meant emperor. Everyone present was well read and such a name caused everyone to be stunned. Su Qingbai frowned slightly. He hesitated and asked, Grandfather, is this name? Mr. Qingyun smiled faintly and said, It's just a name. I think this child is suitable for this name. Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly and nodded, Mr. Qingyun is right. It's just a name. I's son can't use a good name? Everyone was silent. Was this a problem of a name? No one dared to use such a name, even the emperor's son. Su Qingbai glanced at his grandfather, who had a calm expression on his face. His grandfather was a great scholar. He would know the meaning of this name and he would never not know what was taboo. Since his father, eldest brother and Prince Ding did not object, everyone must know. So he smiled and said, I thought wrong. Madame Su saw that everyone had no objection. She looked lovingly at the baby in her arms and smiled. Little baby, your name will be Mo Yuchen from now on. Little Yuchen. Mo Shuyao glanced at the baby and said, Madame Su, you don't have to be so polite. Just call him Mo Xiaobao. Mo Shuyao spared no effort to destroy his son's reputation. He had to nail his nickname before Mo Xiaobao could speak. Mrs. Su was stunned. She looked at the baby in her arms who was staring at her with big round eyes. She smiled and said, Xiaobao. It's really a baby. Yili covered her face helplessly. Xiaobao, I'm sorry. After the women and the baby went to rest, the hall quieted down. Mr. Qingyun looked sideways at Mo Shuyao and Yili sitting side by side. A trace of relief flashed in his eyes and he asked, Prince, have you really made up your mind? Everyone was startled and looked at Mo Shuyao in unison. Mo Shuyao's lips twitched slightly and he smiled coldly. What choice do I have to make? Didn't the royal family choose a Prince Ding mansion more than 10 years ago? Everyone present couldn't help but fall silent. It was easy for power to intoxicate people. Back then the ancestral emperor and the Ding king Mo Lanyun had sworn an oath that their descendants would be brothers forever and share the great Chu empire. It might not have been a pretense but it had only been a few generations, and the two families had already reached the point of life and death. The royal family's methods and actions were really too chilling. Su Hongyu looked at Mo Shuyao and said, Prince, do you have any plans now? Mo Shuyao smiled faintly and said, Of course I have plans but I need to plan slowly. Su Hongyu nodded. It is good that the prince can calm down. The most worrying thing about Mo Shuyao's current situation was that he couldn't keep his cool. Having just learned of the blood feud between his father and brother, as well as the pointless sacrifice of so many Mahist army, there weren't many people who could keep their cool. But compared to the Central Plains and Jiangnan, the Northwest was more remote and barren. If Prince Ding was too impatient and prematurely advanced, and if Mo Jingqi decided to fight to the death in the end, both sides would suffer and the fishermen would benefit. Mo Shuyao understood Su Hongyu's meaning and smiled faintly. So many years have passed, what can't I wait for? Don't worry, Mr. Hongyu. In the future, many matters in the Northwest will have to trouble Mr. Hongyu and Mr. Hongyan. With these words, he had the intention of entrusting them with important tasks. Su Hongyu nodded slightly. It is my duty. Chapter 456. Yili said, Lier has prepared a residence not far from the Wangfu for my two uncles. However, due to the lack of time, there are still many places that have not been cleaned up. I will have to trouble my uncles and cousins to stay in the Wangfu for the time being. Originally, Yili had thought that everyone would stay in the Wangfu. After all, the Wangfu was big enough and there was no need to worry about not having enough space. However, both of her uncles were elders after all and they each had their own families. Her cousins, other than her fifth brother, were all of marriageable age. Although living in the Wangfu would not cause her uncles, aunts and cousins to feel uncomfortable, she was worried that they would feel uncomfortable. Su Hongyu nodded and said, Lier has troubled you. Yili smiled and looked eagerly at Master Qin saying, Grandfather, how about living in the Wangfu? If Lier and Prince have any questions they can ask me at any time. Nonsense. Master Qingyun glanced at her and softly reprimanded, How can a grandfather stay at his granddaughter's home? If other people knew they would think that your uncle is unfilial. Also, the residence that you have arranged will not be far from the Wangfu. If you miss your grandfather you can just walk around more. Also, grandfather is used to living in the countryside and is not used to places that are too lively. Yili naturally knew that Master Qingyun would not allow it. She was not dejected and said with a smile, Lier is fooling around. Grandfather, uncle, don't be angry. There is a residence on a mountain 5 li outside the city. The scenery is not bad. Prince had someone buy it a few days ago. Just treat it as a gift from Lier and Prince to grandfather. Grandfather, please do not refuse. Master Qingyun's expression was gentle as he said with a faint smile, Grandfather knows that you are filial. Grandfather will not refuse. We can go back and reopen the academy. Thinking of the Lishan Academy that had already been turned to ashes, Master Qingyun was not without any sadness. Although all the ancient books had been taken away, Lishan Academy was an ancient place with special meaning. Yili nodded and said, "Grandfather, do not worry. Lishan Academy will definitely be reopened. It will be even better than before." Master Qingyun nodded, "You are right. The Su family's welcoming banquet was held at the Dingwang Fu. In order to show respect to the Su family, Mo Xiuyao invited all the civil and military officials in Riyang. He even informed the Prince Ding Mansion's trusted elites stationed in other prefectures in the northwest. She very seriously introduced the Su family to the generals and officials of the northwest. It also made everyone understand that the Su family was not just the maternal family of Ding Wangfei. In the future they would have an important position in the northwest. And because of the Su family's original reputation, people naturally didn't have any thoughts of rejection or jealousy. As long as one was slightly knowledgeable, they would understand that the Su family coming to the northwest at this time would only be beneficial to Prince Ding's residents and the Mo family army. The banquet was naturally very lively, and the atmosphere was harmonious and festive. Walking back with the others when they passed through the garden, they saw Qin Jing sitting alone in the pavilion by the pond, lost in thought. Yili stopped and asked softly, "Why is Sister Jing'er here?" Qin Shuang said, "Just now at the banquet Miss Qin seemed to be a little uncomfortable, so she left first." Qin Shuang said, "Miss Qin came to the northwest alone, perhaps she is not used to it." Yili lowered her eyebrows and thought for a moment, then said, "Wait here for a while." Yili walked into the pavilion with light steps and laughed softly, "Sister Jing'er, why are you sitting here?" Qin Jing was clearly startled. Turning back to see Yili, she let out a sigh of relief and stood up. "Wang Fei?" Yili reached out to stop her from standing up. She said with a helpless smile, "It's only been a year, but Sister Jing'er and I have become more distant." Qin Jing looked awkwardly at Yili, not knowing what to say. Yili said with a smile, "Could it be that after Sister Jing'er and Ji get married, you will continue to call me Wang Fei?" Qin Zheng's face reddened and she stared helplessly at Yili, feeling a bit more at ease. After teasing, Yili sat down and held Qin Zheng's hand, saying, "I see that Sister Jing'er is unhappy. Is there something you are not used to, or did the Fu neglect you in some way?" Qin Jing quickly shook her head, the corners of her eyes red. She said in a low voice, "Everyone is very good to me. Just, I miss home. Father and mother raised me and were very obedient. But I have not repaid them at all and have left them. I am really unfilial." Yili sighed softly and patted Qin Zheng's hand. She said softly, "Lord Qin and Madame Qin are willing to let Sister leave the capital. Naturally, it is for Sister's happiness. Sister, you just have to settle down in the northwest. It's not like you will never have a chance to meet again. Right now the most important thing is Ergu and Sister Jing'er's marriage." In the evening, eldest aunt and second aunt told me about this matter. It seems that Ergu and second aunt are anxious to marry Sister Jing. Qin Zheng's beautiful face was so red it could drip blood. But she could not avoid Yili's teasing and could only cover her face with her hands. She said discontentedly, "We haven't seen each other for a year. Why is Li learning from Murong?" Yili said with a smile, "What's wrong with learning from Murong? Say what is on your mind lest it bothers you." Chapter 457. Mo Xiuyao's almost tangible resentment finally attracted Yili's attention. She turned to look at the man sitting by the bed, staring at the baby in her hands with a gloomy face, and sighed helplessly in her heart. Other men hated that they could not have a precious son, but the one in front of her was like his son was his enemy in his previous life. She carefully placed the baby in Mo Xiuyao's hands and smiled. "Prince, are you still young? Why are you throwing a tantrum with the baby?" Mo Xiuyao snorted and ravaged the little meatball in his hands with heartache. "Did you raise him to be so fat to eat?" Yili rolled her eyes. The baby was round, white and tender, but he was far from fat, okay? Fortunately, Mo Xiuyao also knew that his Yili did not like others disdaining her precious son, so he did not say more. He only disdained Mo Xiuyao, who did not know anything and was powerless to resist his ravaging, and asked, "Why did you come back so late?" Yili told him about seeing Qin Jing in the garden and then asked, "Eldest aunt and second aunt's intention is to set the wedding date after the baby's 1-month birthday party. Eldest aunt's intention is to let Sister Jing'er get married from eldest uncle's residence. In my opinion, it is better to get married from the prince's residence." What do you think? After all, marrying from eldest uncle's home to second uncle's home did not seem right. Emo Shuyao thought for a moment and said, we don't have any elders in our residence. You can't send Qin Jing to get married. In terms of age, you are younger than her. How about this? General Liu, General Zhang and their families are all in Ruyang. You see which family is suitable for them to take Qin Jing as their adopted daughter. When the time comes, she will get married from the general's residence. General Liu and General Zhang are both top generals in the Mahist army. It is not a disgrace for Qin Jing to become their disciple. In this way, the Su family and the Mahist army will be connected by marriage. After all, the Prince Ding mansion started with military exploits. With this relationship, it will be much more convenient for the Su family in the northwest. Both Zhang Qilan and Lu Jingxian were highly respected veterans of the Mahist army. With their support, the Mahist army's rejection of the Su family would be greatly reduced. At the end of the day, as long as it was an army, there was no one who wasn't xenophobic. Yili didn't expect Emo Shuyao to have thought of so many things in such a short time. Most of them were for the sake of the Su family. She felt a slight sweetness in her heart and said softly, "Thank you for thinking so much for the Su family." Emo Shuyao snorted softly and lowered his head to play with his son. Yili looked helplessly at the man who lowered his head and ignored her. She really wanted to ask, "Prince, are you being arrogant?" The news of the birth of the little heir of Prince Ding's residence spread to the surrounding countries at an extremely fast speed. Not to mention, Emo Shuyao had also sent out invitations everywhere to invite the influential officials of various countries to Ruyang to attend the little heir's 1-month-old birthday banquet. After receiving the gorgeous invitation with the Ding Mansion's symbol, countless people smashed the priceless antiques and calligraphy in the study. Shiling Jinan Palace in the study, Genin of Gojoseon stared at the gorgeous invitation on the table and narrowed his eyes dangerously. Genin of Gojoseon didn't say anything. The other people in the study naturally didn't dare to speak either. For a moment the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. After a long time, Genin of Gojoseon's son Lei Tingfeng, who was standing to the side, said, "Father, what does Emo Shuyao mean by this? Is he really going to break off relations with the Dechu state?" As the Prince Ding of the Dechu state, no matter how famous the Ding mansion was, they didn't have the qualifications to invite the influential officials of the various countries to a prince's 1-month-old celebration. In fact, even the royal families of the various countries wouldn't invite the influential officials of other countries to a prince's 1-month-old celebration. However, if Emo Shuyao broke off relations with the Dechu state and established himself as the king, then at least he had the qualifications to speak with the royal families of the various countries. Thus, this invitation wasn't considered disrespectful. As for whether Emo Shuyao was willing to hold a 1-month-old celebration for his son, no one could stop him. Genin of Gojoseon sneered, "The Ding mansion and the Dechu state will break off relations sooner or later. It's not unexpected. However, I didn't expect that Princess Ding would be able to return alive." What was even more unexpected was that after falling from such a high cliff, not only was Princess Ding fine, even the child in her stomach was fine. Emo Shuyao's luck was so good that it made people hate him. Thinking of this matter, Genin of Gojoseon's face became even uglier. Not only did he lose to a woman, but it was also a pregnant woman. Yili. Genin of Gojoseon gritted his teeth. Lei Tingfeng glanced at his father's sinister face. However, he wasn't as angry as Genin of Gojoseon. Thinking of the graceful woman in green who looked elegant but always shocked people, Lei Tingfeng couldn't deny that when he heard the news of Princess Ding's death, he also felt a faint sense of pity. He didn't expect that Princess Ding would return safely and give birth to Prince Ding's son. A faint sense of envy arose in Lei Tingfeng's heart. However, he quickly dismissed this thought. "Father, should we go to Prince Ding's 1-month-old celebration?" "Since that's the case, I will naturally keep his identity a secret." "It's a pity. That woman Suzuki. Since she can tell his identity, how can she not tell others?" Chapter 458. Lei Tingfeng frowned. "Then who does father think has the imperial jade seal?" Genim of Gojoseon pondered for a moment and said, "With the temperament of the people in the Ding mansion, the imperial jade seal is not important to them. Emo Shuyao is more arrogant than Emo Lufeng. He disdains to use the imperial jade seal to raise the prestige of the Mahist army." Lei Tingfeng said, Father means. Genom of Gojosian waved his hand. No, the Imperial Jade Seal may not be in Emo Xiao's hands, but it may not be in Tanjiji's hands either. So this trip, we must go to the northwest. At least the Imperial Jade Seal cannot fall into the hands of others. I understand. Lei Tingfring nodded. Father is going to Ruyang personally? Genom of Gojosian nodded. You go with I. There are no major events in West Hill recently. I accept. The atmosphere in the imperial study of the Chu Palace became more dignified. Emo Jingqi was so angry that his face turned black. He threw the invitation in his hand far away. Emo Yuchen. What a good Emo Yuchen. Emo Xiao, you are very good. Emo Jingli, who also received an invitation and entered the imperial study, saw the invitation marked with the Prince Ding Mansion's seal. Raising his hand to catch it, Emo Jingli smiled and said, Brother, who made you so angry? Seeing this brother of the same mother, Emo Jingqi's face became more ugly. He said coldly, What are you doing in the imperial palace? Emo Jingli smiled and took out another invitation. He smiled and said, I came to pay my respects to mother. In addition, it seems that brother also received Prince Ding's invitation. What are you planning to do? He opened the invitation and saw the name of the heir of the Prince Ding mansion written on it. Emo Yuchen. What a good name. Emo Xiao, you can't hold it in anymore? Emo Jingqi looked at his younger brother coldly. After his brother returned from the south, he had obviously become smarter and harder to deal with. If he didn't suddenly become enlightened, then there must be an expert guiding him from behind. What are your plans? Since Emo Xiao sent someone to send you an invitation, does Imperial Brother plan to go? Emo Jingli smiled and said, Prince Ding personally sent an invitation. How could Imperial Brother not go? What gift does Imperial Brother intend to give to Prince Ding? Emo Jingqi coldly snorted. Suddenly, a malicious smile appeared on his face as he said, But Royal Brother should go. After all, Yili and Royal Brother are not strangers. Furthermore, she is Princess Consort Li's elder sister. At the mention of this, Emo Jingli's expression became ugly. Whenever he thought of Yili who only knew how to cry and whine in his fu, and then thought of Yili who could go to the battlefield and the court and had the support of the Su family behind her, Emo Jingli couldn't help but have a stomachache whenever he thought of the fact that Yili had once been his fiancée. If he had taken Yili back then, what would it have been like? With Yili's ability to defeat Genom of Gojosian of Shilling, maybe he wouldn't have needed to fight his imperial brother in the north and south, and would have directly attacked the Chu capital. And that Su Qingchen, how much trouble had she caused for him in the south? If his princess consort was Yili, Su Qingchen would not only not cause trouble for him, she would help him. Maybe she could even help him take down Nanzhao and not be controlled by Nanzhao like now. Seeing Emo Jingli's expression suddenly turn dark, Emo Jingqi's mood instantly improved. He raised an eyebrow and said, Since Imperial Brother is going, why not bring Princess Consort Li with you? She can also reminisce about the past with Yili. Emo Jingli gritted his teeth and said lightly, Many thanks for Imperial Brother's advice. Since this is the case, Qin will go and prepare first. Seeing that there isn't much time left, we will depart for the northwest tomorrow morning. Emo Jingqi nodded and said, Imperial Brother, please go. When Emo Jingli left, the smile on Emo Jingqi's face disappeared without a trace. Did Emo Jingli think that he didn't know what he wanted to do in the northwest? To celebrate Emo Xiaoyao's son's 1-month birthday? Emo Jingli would only want Emo Xiaoyao's son to die early more than him. Because the child's mother was his former fiancée. Yi Li's existence was simply telling everyone in the world that he, King Li, was blind as a bat. You want to go to the northwest to find the Imperial Jade Seal? Emo Jingli, your appetite is a bit too big. Emperor. Is there any news of Tanjiji's whereabouts? Emo Jingqi asked coldly as he looked at the gray-clothed person kneeling in the hall. Emperor, please forgive me. For now there is no news of Tanjiji's whereabouts. Bang. Emo Jingqi grabbed the inkstone on the table and threw it over. The gray-clothed person on the ground naturally didn't dare to dodge. The inkstone hit his shoulder and fell to the ground. The gray-clothed person gave a muffled grunt. Emperor, please forgive me. A group of trash. Go search again. Even if you have to dig 3 feet into the ground, you must find Tanjiji for Zhen. Yes. There were still a few days until Prince Ding's 1-month-old banquet, but Ruyang City was already bustling with noise and excitement. Because of last year's war in the northwest, many wealthy merchants fled to the borders. As a result, the commerce in the northwest had stagnated and even regressed. This time, the moment Mo Xiaobao was born, the Prince Ding mansion announced to the world that they were wantonly celebrating the little heir. Because of the previous dynasty's treasures and the imperial jade seal, a steady stream of people poured into the northwest. In less than a month, Ruyang City seemed to have slowly become prosperous. Previously, the largest city in the northwest, Xinyang City, had turned into a sea of fire. Now that the Prince Ding mansion was stationed in Ruyang City seemed to gradually become the largest city in the northwest. In order to entertain guests from all over, the common people in the city had already tidied up their homes early on, preparing to take advantage of this bustle to make a fortune. In the Prince Ding mansion, because of the addition of the Su family, Mo Shuyao and Yili felt a lot more relaxed. In the Su family, other than Master Qingyun, who was already old and enjoying his life in the mansion and would occasionally visit Su Zhe, who was recuperating, Su Hongyu, Su Hongyan, and the 5 young masters of the Su family, even the youngest, Su Qingyan, could follow Su Qingbai and help out a little. Su Hongyu and Su Qingchen were originally rare geniuses. With them, Mo Shuyao immediately threw most of the affairs in the northwest to them. His days were very relaxed and comfortable. Li did you write this thing? In the spacious study, several tables were placed together to form a large table. All kinds of documents and files were neatly arranged on top of it. Several people sat around the table. As they dealt with the files in their hands, they would occasionally exchange a few words. Although everyone had their own study, under normal circumstances, they still liked to deal with business in the large study. It was not cold and boring, and when they could not make up their minds, they could ask for the opinions of others. Su Qingchen raised his head and asked as he held a file about the business plans in the northwest. Yili raised her head from between the files and looked blankly at Su Qingchen. She did not know what he was talking about. Mo Xiaoyao, sitting next to her, glanced and said, "It's about the business development plan in the northwest." I wrote it." Yili finally remembered. She said with some embarrassment, "Actually, I only have a general idea. I'm not familiar with these things. Didn't you say before that it was given to Mingxi and Leng Er to handle?" Mo Xiaoyao said, "Leng Er has returned to the pass. Han Mingxi has to manage the northwest and Nanzhao and Beirong by himself. He is too busy, so it was put aside for now." Hearing them say this, the others also raised their heads to look at Su Qingchen. Su Qingchen handed the file in his hand to Su Hongyu. Everyone looked at it. Su Hongyu nodded and praised. "Li Er's idea is very novel. We can try and see if it works." Although the Su family was a scholarly family, they were not pedantic. They naturally understood what business meant to a city and even a country. Compared to the rich Central Plains and the Jiangnan region, the Northwest was not considered to be rich. Even the food supply was relatively poor. If they could not find another way, there would be a day when the Mo army would gradually wither away due to the poverty in the Northwest. At first, when they saw Yili and Mo Xiaoyao go in and out every day to deal with the politics of the Northwest and the military affairs of the Mahist army, everyone was surprised. But when they saw the Mahist army generals appear accustomed to it, they felt very gratified. Li Er had enough talent and ability. Most importantly, Prince Ding was willing to give her trust and space to show her ability. This made the Su family's impression of Mo Xiaoyao much better. Chapter 459. The dossier was passed around the room. Su Qingbai was the most interested in this plan. Originally, when he was sent to the southwest region, he was prepared to show off his skills but was summoned back to the capital. Now that he saw this plan, he immediately recalled the feeling of wanting to show off his ambitions when he first arrived in the southwest region. "Li Er, what do you think?" Looking up and seeing everyone staring at her, Yili could only put down the dossier in her hand and ask Shuijing to bring over a map to hang on the wall. She also had someone bring over some freshly brewed tea. After thinking seriously for a while, she said, "The Northwest's area is less than 1/6 of the Dechu states, and its population is less than 1/10 of the Dechu states. Although Hangzhou is known as the Northwest's granary, it is still lacking compared to the Southwest, which is known as Tianfu. If it were peacetime, it wouldn't matter. We would only need to import a small amount of food to feed the people and soldiers in the Northwest. But in reality, the worst-case scenario is that we might have to face the 3 million troops of the Dechu state, the northern tribes, and Xiling at the same time. And even if there is no war, the three countries only need to seal off the Northwest's food and economy. Even if the Northwest doesn't immediately fall into trouble, it will only become poorer and poorer. At the same time, the Mahist army will become weaker and weaker. Extinction is only a matter of time. Everyone was indifferent. What Yili said was the truth. It wasn't that the people present didn't know, but that no one had ever laid out the data so clearly in front of them. Because it was clear, it was even more shocking. Feng Jiao frowned. What if we take the initiative to attack? Expand our territory in the northwest? Su Hongyu frowned. It's not impossible, but Shiling's land is barren. Most of their food comes from the Dechu state, Nanzhao, and the western countries. The northern tribes are vast grasslands and deserts. The northern tribes mainly eat cows and sheep. The Dechu state cannot be touched for the time being. Once the Mahist army moves against the Dechu state, it is very likely that Xiling, the northern tribes, and Nanzhao will attack the Mahist army at the same time. Actually, with the Mahist army's strength, what General Feng said might not be impossible, but the losses would be huge. I think Li Er's idea is to take it slow. Yili nodded. That's right. If we make the Northwest a mess, we will be the ones to clean up the mess. Unless we can take down Xiling or northern tribes within half a year. The Mahist army was not just any army. To the Mahist army. Because no matter who wanted to conquer the world or do something else, if they were not strong enough, they would only be ignored by others. When they were strong enough, they could even do anything. As for the Mo family army, from the very beginning, they had been set as everyone's opponent. 2. Su Qingyan tilted his body and stretched his neck to look at the thing in Su Qingbai's hand. He asked, Sister Li Er has already considered so much. Then there must be a way to solve it? Yili smiled helplessly. How can we solve these problems in such a short time? But I have ordered people to survey the entire northwest region. Other than the vicinity of Hangzhou in Ganzhou, which is the middle reaches of Min River, there is a large area of plains. The soil and water quality are excellent. It is just that this area is connected to the northern tribes, so there are very few people. Large areas of fertile land are not cultivated. Su Qingbai said thoughtfully, Li Er, you mean to move the people to Ganzhou to cultivate the land? Then there must be a large number of troops stationed at the border to prevent the northern tribes from raiding. Mo Shuyao nodded. This is not a problem. Now the Mahist army has hundreds of thousands of soldiers who have nothing to do. Moreover, the Mahist army will expand in the future. There is no need to worry about not having enough people to guard it. Yili also nodded. If the people are not assured, the Mahist army can cultivate the land first or cultivate it together with the people. The Mahist army and the people cultivate together? Everyone frowned and hesitated. Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and smiled. Li Er's idea is not bad. The hundreds of thousands of soldiers do not need to fight for the time being. Using them to cultivate the land is not bad. In this way, the Mahist army will have their own harvest and can also reduce the taxes of the people. Su Qingbai nodded and asked impatiently, Then Li Er, what do you think of the business hub that you mentioned? Yili massaged her temples and tidied up her hair before saying, In this world, there is not only the Dechu state, the northern tribes, Xiling and Nanzhao. To the west of Xiling, there are countless small countries and even large countries that we do not know of. It is only because of the long distance that most people do not know of them. Our northwest region is now surrounded by other countries. If we sell the goods of Eastern Chu, northern tribes, and Nanzhao to the countries further west through Xiling, then bring their goods back and sell them to the Dechu state or the northern tribes, they will attract merchants. In the future, Ruyang and even the entire northwest region will become an important economic and trade area between the east and the west. Su Qingbai was a smart person and naturally understood at once. He smiled and said, Li Er, when do you plan on starting? You have to count me in. Me too. Su Qingyan had always adhered to the policy of following his fourth brother and quickly raised his hand to vote. Yili smiled and said, We have already sent some people to the agriculture area. As for business, fourth brother has no experience. You can ask Han Mingxi and Leng Haoyu. Thinking of the busy Han Mingxi and Leng Haoyu, Yili felt a headache coming on. She then thought of a certain person who was currently dispirited somewhere and felt some regret. She should not have killed Su Zuidi so quickly. Otherwise, she would have gotten such a good free worker. Reporting to Prince and Princess Consort, King Li and Princess Consort Li of the Chu capital have arrived. As she spoke, a guard came in to report. King Li. Emojing Li. Yi Li was startled. She did not expect him to come to Ruyang and bring Yi Ying with him. Speaking of which, Yi Li had not seen Yi Ying for nearly 2 years. Originally she had been imprisoned by Emojing Qi. Now that Emojing Li had returned to the capital and was holding a large number of troops, he seemed to be on par with Emojing Qi. As Princess Consort Li Ying was naturally free. Emo Shuyao stood up and smiled. Emojing Li? Since that's the case. Li, let's go welcome King Li and Princess Consort Li. I also want to see how much this Emojing Li has grown after not seeing him for so long. Yi Li naturally did not have any objections. She stood up and followed Emo Shuyao outside. Only Su Qingbai still had questions to ask and seemed to want to continue. Although it was called a welcome, it was only when Chief Steward Emo invited them in that Yi Li and Emo Shuyao walked to the entrance of the hall to welcome them. Emojing Li clearly did not expect to receive any good treatment from Emo Shuyao. His expression was still normal. Just as they approached the Prince Ding Mansion's hall, they saw a beautiful couple standing at the entrance. Emo Shuyao was dressed in a light purple brocade robe. His snow-white hair was casually pulled back. Compared to before, he seemed to be more cold and intimidating. Yi Li, on the other hand, was dressed in a light green dress with a silver peony pattern. Her smile was as gentle as before, but there was more nobility and charm between her brows. Seeing the smiling green-clothed woman standing beside Emo Shuyao, Emojing Li's eyes flashed. For a moment he did not know what to feel. Chapter 460. Li Wang and Li Wangfei are honored by your presence. Welcome. Seeing that Emo Shuyao did not plan on speaking, Yi Li said with a faint smile. Before this year, Yi Ying was very different from the fourth miss of the Yi family whose name had spread through the capital. Her expression, which had always been weak and helpless, was now filled with hidden bitterness and stupefaction. Her watery eyes, which were as clear as autumn waters, had become much sharper, and her originally weak temperament had weakened a lot. Following silently by Emojing Li's side, she looked more like a princess than before. But Yi Li did not miss the hint of jealousy and bitterness that flashed through Yi Ying's eyes when she looked at her. She couldn't help but laugh inside. Yi Ying might have suffered greatly these past 2 years, but what did she have to be jealous of her? Jealous that she had led troops to battle and risked her life on the battlefield? Or jealous that she had almost lost her life when she fell off the cliff? Emojing Li looked at the two people standing side by side in front of him and said coolly, "Long time no see, how have you been?" Emo Shuyao raised an eyebrow in surprise. Emojing Li knew how to greet him properly? It seemed that he had learned some bad things in the past year. He nodded coolly and said with a faint smile, "Thank you for your concern." Emojing Li's expression froze and he looked as ugly as if he had swallowed a fly. Who was concerned about him? Yi Li smiled and looked at Emo Shuyao. Emojing Li said with a smile, "Please come in." After entering the hall and sitting down, Yi Li noticed that Emojing Li had brought another person. It was also a familiar face that she had not seen in a long time, Princess Xixia. Princess Xixia was dressed as a servant girl and followed beside Emojing Li. But she kept her head down. Yi Li thought that she was just a normal servant girl. However, she followed everyone into the hall. Yi Li realized that something was wrong. No wonder Yi Ying's expression was so ugly. When Emojing Li left the Chu capital, he brought Princess Xixia with him. She didn't expect that he would bring her with him to the northwest. Clearly, Emojing Li treated Princess Xixia differently. The host and guest sat down. Yi Li hesitated for a moment, then looked at Princess Xixia and said, "This is..." Before Emojing Li could say anything, Yi Ying opened her mouth and said indifferently, "She's just a servant girl. Third sister, why do you care about her?" Hearing this, Emojing Li's expression darkened. Princess Xixia's expression was also ugly. Originally, with Princess Xixia's status, she was more than qualified to be an equal concubine. But after the commotion at the wedding, Princess Xixia had no choice but to fake her death to discuss this matter. Originally, Yi Li thought that Emojing Li would quickly find another identity for Princess Xixia. She didn't expect that even now this concubine's identity was still unknown. Seeing that Emojing Li didn't speak, Yi Li didn't care. She ordered someone to bring tea. "Prince Ding's current appearance has given I quite a fright," Yi Futian said. Emojing Li said. Although he had long heard of Prince Ding's white hair, Mo Jingli was still a little surprised to see it with his own eyes. He glanced sideways at Yi Li sitting next to Mo Shuyao. In his mind he assessed that Yi Li was more important to Mo Shuyao than they thought. Mo Shuyao didn't care at all. He casually brushed back the hair that fell to his chest and said with a smile, "Flowers bloom and wilt. Birth, old age, illness and death are all normal. Why care? But I heard that Prince Li has been very proud of his success in Jiangnan this year?" Mo Jingli tugged at the corner of his lips and said, "Prince Ding overpraises me. How can I be as free as Prince Ding who occupies the northwest?" The two men began to argue back and forth. If it was in the past, Mo Jingli might not have had the courage and confidence to contend with Mo Shuyao. But it was different now. Mo Shuyao occupied the northwest while he occupied Jiangnan. Compared to the barren and rich northwest, Jiangnan clearly had an advantage. Yi Li smiled at Yi Ying and said with a smile, "Fourth sister, how have you been this year?" Yi Ying looked at Yi Li with a complicated expression. She snorted and said with a cold smile, "Third sister, don't you know that I was imprisoned by the emperor? How good can a prisoner be?" Her words seemed to be blaming Yi Li for not saving her when she knew that Mo Jingqi had imprisoned her. Yi Li didn't care. She and Yi Ying didn't have a deep sisterly relationship. If it was said that it was a small matter, she would have saved her. But at that time, Yi Ying could be said to be Mo Jingqi's hostage to Mo Jingli. Naturally, she would be heavily guarded. Why would she waste the effort to sacrifice her own subordinate? Yi Li's expression was normal in the face of Yi Ying's questioning. She comforted her, "Now that fourth sister and Prince Li have reunited, and you have Prince Li's heir, your days will be over." Hearing this, Yi Ying's face darkened and her expression became even uglier. Yi Li thought for a moment and immediately understood. Mo Jingli probably didn't intend to make Yi Ying's child the heir. That's right. Mo Jingli was still young. If he wanted to have a child, how could he not have one? And Yi Ying could be said to have no foundation other than her half-sister. She couldn't even compare to the families of ordinary officials. And her sister didn't have a good relationship with her. The two families were even enemies. Of course, Mo Jingli wouldn't consider making Yi Ying's child the heir. He was probably already planning to choose a woman with a good family background as his concubine. Yi Li naturally couldn't care about these things. She simply didn't ask and pulled Yi Ying to talk about other things. Yi Ying listened to Yi Li in silence. Chapter 461. It was bustling and crowded outside the main entrance of Prince Ding's residence. It was unknown if it was a coincidence or if it was done on purpose, but the distinguished guests from the three countries had rushed to the entrance of Prince Ding's residence at the same time. Hence the entrance of Prince Ding's residence was completely surrounded by the carriages, attendants and guards of these people. However, with the Black Cloud Cavalry acting as guards outside the Prince Ding mansion, these people could not even think about getting close to the Prince Ding mansion. The Prince Ding mansion's door opened from the inside. Mo Shuyao and Yi Li came out hand in hand. Under the sunlight, the snow-white hair flashed with a cold luster. The people who just came out of the carriage were stunned. They were the most powerful group of people in their respective kingdoms. They had already received Mo Shuyao's white hair message. But just like Mo Jingli, when they saw the white-haired man in front of them, they could not hide their surprise. But what was puzzling was that when the princess consort fell off the cliff and disappeared, Prince Ding was fine. How come when Princess Ding came back, Prince Ding's hair turned white overnight? You have all come from afar. I hope you will forgive me for being late. Mo Shuyao glanced at the crowd and smiled apologetically. We dare not. We are already familiar with Prince Ding. Prince Ding, why are you being so polite? This is Princess Ding. Seeing you today, you really live up to your reputation. The young man in the royal family of the northern tribes was tall and straight. He had the rough and handsome appearance of the people of the northern tribes, but his aura was extraordinary. Standing beside him was the seventh prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Yi, and Princess Ronghua, who had not been seen for a long time. Princess Ronghua nodded at Yi Li and smiled faintly. Her beautiful face was not as pale and delicate as it was in the Chu capital. Instead, it was more rosy and healthy. It seemed that Princess Ronghua had been living well in the northern tribes for more than a year. The man who spoke was naturally the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong. Yi Li smiled faintly and said, Crown Prince of the northern tribes, you flatter me. Since everyone has come from afar, Please come in and have a cup of tea before resting at the post house. Yelu Hong looked at Yi Li with some surprise, then said with a smile, Thank you, Wang Fei. Princess Anqi stepped forward and said with a smile, Princess Ding, long time no see. How have you been? Yi Li felt a little embarrassed when she saw Princess Anqi's bright smile. She had deceived Princess Anqi more than once in Nanzhao, yet Princess Anqi was still speaking to her in such a pleasant manner. She wondered how much face Su Qingchen had given her. Princess Ding nodded and said with a smile, Big sister princess, I trust you have been well since we last met. It just so happens that Big Brother is also in Ruyang. Princess, you can reminisce about old times with Big Brother. Everyone knew that Princess Ding did not have an elder brother in her family, so who else could she call Big Brother? Yi Li wasn't afraid to tell everyone that Su Qingchen was in the northwest. She didn't want the Su family to hide. Since she had to tell her sooner or later, it was no big deal to tell her now. Sure enough, Princess Anqi smiled more happily after hearing the news about Su Qingchen. She said with a smile, Thank you, Wang Fei. Princess Ding, how have you been? Lei Tingfeng from the West Hill came forward to greet her. Although all the countries had some grudges against the Mahist army, the West Hill was in the most awkward position. Last year, the two armies fought a war and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the West Hill died in the northwest. Of course, the Mahist army's Wang Fei falling off a cliff was more serious. Therefore, even if the two sides temporarily put aside their grudges and pretended to be at peace, they still felt a little uncomfortable. Mo Xiuyao stepped forward and held Yi Li's slender waist with one hand. He smiled at Lei Tingfeng and said, Thank you for your concern. Princess Li is very lucky. Lei Tingfeng was also helpless. He wasn't the one who caused Princess Ding to fall off the cliff. But it didn't seem to make any difference if it was his own father. He laughed dryly and said, The Wang Fei is indeed very lucky to have turned misfortune into a blessing. Yi Li patted Mo Xiuyao's hand quietly and said to the crowd with a smile, It's rude of the Prince Ding mansion to let you talk at the door. Please come in. Mo Xiuyao snorted lightly and glanced at Genom of Gojoseon, who was sizing up Yi Li. Then he stepped aside and let them in. Genom of Gojoseon said lightly, I haven't seen you for a year. Prince Ding's kung fu cultivation has become more profound. I wonder if we can have a spar when you're free? Mo Xiuyao smiled ferociously at a place where no one could see. He tilted his head slightly and said, I'll keep you company any time. Princess Ding, it's been a long time. How are you? As if teasing Mo Xiuyao wasn't enough, Genom of Gojoseon turned his gaze to Yi Li and asked Yi Li with a smile. Yi Li nodded lightly and said, Thank you for Genom of Gojoseon's concern. Ben Fei as well. But Prince Ding's injury, is it serious? Sensing that Mo Xiuyao's hand around her waist had tightened, Yi Li could only hate herself for not using more strength to take his life back then. Genom of Gojoseon seemed to remember the wound that Yi Li had given him. He smiled regretfully and said, I will never forget Wang Fei's gift. Yi Li's eyes darkened and she said coolly, Is that so? Ben Fei will also never forget it. Back then I was careless and didn't hit the target. Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, Then this one thanks Wang Fei for being merciful. After finally settling the guests, Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li returned to the study. Only Su Qingchen was left in the study. Seeing them come in, he raised his head and smiled. You've returned? Yi Li smiled and said, Dagu is still busy? Aren't you going to see your good friend? Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and said, Anqi is here? Yi Li nodded and said, Right now, Nanzhao doesn't seem to be able to send any other important envoys other than Princess Anqi. Dagu isn't going to see her? Just now, Princess Anqi's face was filled with disappointment when she left. Su Qingchen glanced coolly at her and said coolly, I will go visit Princess Anqi later. Why are you in such a hurry? Yi Li was helpless. Her Dagu was like an immortal that mortals could not afford to offend. It was really depressing. Walking through thousands of flowers without a single leaf touching him? No, he didn't even walk through the flowers. He just looked at them from a distance that was neither close nor far, neither light nor heavy. He made people feel that he was close and gentle as if he was within reach. But when they really touched him, they felt that he was beyond the 9 heavens. Even her eldest aunt was slightly worried that her Dagu would see through the mortal world and cultivate immortality. It was not that Yi Li wanted to put her Dagu and Princess Anqi together. But these years, the only woman who could get close to her Dagu was Princess Anqi. Genum of Gojosian of Xiling, heir Genum of Gojosian, the crown prince of the northern tribes and the seventh prince, the crown princess of Nanzhao and Prince Li of Dechu State. Hearing Yi Li mention the people who came this time, Su Qingchen said thoughtfully, even if it's for the so-called Imperial Jade Seal, the people who came this time are a little too important. These people were the most important people in all countries. Genum of Gojosian of Xiling was even more important than the Emperor of Xiling. These people all gathered in Ruyang. If it was just for the Imperial Jade Seal, it would be making a mountain out of a molehill. Yi Li smiled and said, Dagu and Shuyao are the same. They don't think much of the Imperial Jade Seal, but others may not think so. The so-called Imperial Jade Seal, whoever obtains it can obtain the world. Yi Li felt that this sentence had always been sarcastic. It should be whoever obtains the world can obtain it. Whether it was the ancient emperor or the recent Gaozu of the previous dynasty, who didn't obtain the Imperial Jade Seal when they were close to the end of the country. If you don't have anything, even if the Imperial Jade Seal fell from the sky and landed in your arms, you would only be cannon fodder. Chapter 462. Ali is right. With the Imperial Jade Seal, you will have the so-called fate of the heavens. What's more, it is said that the great ancestor of the previous dynasty's treasure house contains the secret books of the great ancestor of the previous dynasty and the treasures left behind when the country was founded. Emo Shuyao smiled faintly. In the eyes of those people, the most valuable thing was not the treasures, but the great ancestor's art of war. Who dared to compare the art of war with the Mahist army? Originally, there was also Genum of Gojosian, who was known as the West Hill God of War. However, since Genum of Gojosian was defeated by Princess Ding, in the eyes of the West Hill soldiers, the Mahist army was simply Genum of Gojosian's nemesis. Genum of Gojosian was invincible throughout his life, but he was defeated by the Mahist army again and again. It was understandable that he was defeated by Mo Lufeng. After all, the Prince Ding mansion had a long history and Mo Lufeng was a genius of a generation. However, it was unreasonable that he was defeated by Princess Ding. A teenage girl from a scholarly family could defeat Genum of Gojosian, who had experienced hundreds of battles. If she was not a natural nemesis, then what was? Speaking of the Imperial Jade Seal, Yi Li could not help but frown and ask, will Tan Jiji come to the northwest this time? Mo Shuyao nodded and said, Shu Manlin is still in Ruyang. Unless Tan Jiji doesn't want her anymore, he will definitely come. Shu Manlin? Su Qingchen raised his eyebrows and smiled. He did not know when the Saintess of Nanjiang came to the northwest. Yi Li smiled and said, I forgot to tell you. Speaking of which, you and the Saintess of Nanjiang are old acquaintances. Previously, the Saintess of Nanjiang mentioned you to me. Do you want to meet him? Su Qingchen rubbed Yi Li's head helplessly, ignoring Mo Shuyao's displeased look. She smiled and said, forget it. I'm sure she doesn't want anyone else to know that she's here. The Saintess of the southern border was not allowed to leave the southern Zhao imperial city. If the people of the southern border found out, then Shu Manlin's position as the Saintess of the southern border would come to an end. In Ruyang City, people came from all over the place to participate in the grand event. This city, which was originally not very famous in the northwest, suddenly became bustling and lively. Many foreign peddlers had appeared on the streets, peddling various goods from the pass, Western Hill, Northern Army and Southern Zhao to the pedestrians. The various inns, restaurants and tea houses in the city were also filled with people. It was not only the envoys from the imperial court who entered the city every day. There were also merchants from various places, swordsmen from Jianghu and even travelers. The entire Ruyang city appeared to be unprecedentedly lively and prosperous. Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion was a newly opened singing and dancing establishment in Ruyang City, but in less than 2 months, it had become the #1 singing and dancing establishment in the Northwest. But Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion was completely different from ordinary brothels. The girls of Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion only sold their skills and not their bodies. Rather than calling it a singing and dancing establishment, it was better to call it a restaurant. Because not only were there the most beautiful girls, there was also the best wine and the most delicious wine. Here you could find girls to listen to music and dance, but you could not have girls accompany you to drink, let alone other services. Therefore, Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion not only entertained male guests, but also female guests. But people had this kind of temperament. The more you were not allowed to do something, the more you would think she was the best. After all, listening to music, drinking wine, and admiring beauties was the same. Going to a brothel and drinking tea at Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion, the latter was more elegant. Moreover, the beauties in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion were genuine beauties. They didn't have the heavy makeup and coquettish voices of those in brothels. Each and every one of them wore the same style and color of clothes as they served dishes in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion. As for those who performed music, chess, calligraphy, painting, poetry, singing and dancing, they were the beauties of beauties. Not to mention these barren lands without many beauties in the northwest, even the scholars and poets from Jiangnan would be intoxicated. Yili sat in a wing room on the second floor of Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion, leaning against the window and looking outside. It was already night, but all of Riyang City was brightly lit like it was daytime. There was a high platform across from Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion. Seemed to be playing some kind of arena game. There was a flow of people downstairs and it seemed to be more lively than during the day. It's so late, Wang Fei, why have you come out? Yaoji was wearing a red robe. Her beautiful face had recovered 70 to 80%. She did not look as beautiful as before, but people felt she was more gentle and moving. Pushing open the door and coming in, Yaoji leaned against the door and asked with a smile. Yili smiled faintly and said, I had nothing to do so I came out to see. You've managed Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion well. Yaoji curled her lips and said, yes, it's good. I have to thank you for your kindness, Wang Fei. Otherwise, it would be a pity for so many beauties in Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion to become prostitutes. Yili looked at her with a faint smile and said, who said that beauties must open brothels? There are many brothels under Tianyi Pavilion. It's not worthwhile to open another one. Besides, Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion may not earn less than your Qingqing Lane, right? Yaoji nodded and said with a smile, you're right, Wang Fei. Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion's expenses were extremely high. Even Yaoji, who used to run the #1 brothel in the capital, couldn't help but be speechless. However, business was very good these days. In less than half a month they made a lot of money. Therefore there was one thing that was right. People were born to be cheap. Remember, if you want a girl to accompany you, tell them to go to those brothels by themselves. The Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion only provides the best wine, the best dishes, the most pleasant tunes, the most beautiful dances and the most exciting talent shows. Nothing else. Yili ordered as she watched the scene downstairs. Yaoji nodded and said, Yaoji understands. Speaking of which, today Prince Li, the 7th prince of the northern tribes, and the crown prince of Shilinggenom of Gojoseon all came to Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion. Yili smiled and said, Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion has risen too quickly. It would be strange if they didn't come. Don't pay attention to them. Do what you need to do. Yaoji covered her mouth and smiled. Now I believe that Wang Fei said Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion exists to make money. But it's lively these days. When these people leave. Yili smiled and said, don't worry. This time many people came and won't leave. In the future more people will come. This will require Concentrated Fragrance Pavilion's efforts to tell those rich people the benefits of living and doing business in Riyang City. Yaoji understands. Yaoji walked to the window and curiously followed Yili's gaze. What is Wang Fei looking at? Yili pointed at the arena not far across the street and asked, what's going on there? Yaoji smiled and said, setting up an arena. These days not only are there many merchants coming to Riyang, there are also many young masters and martial artists. That arena has been set up for 2 days, but the champion seems to be from the northern tribes. If you win, the prize is a treasured knife studded with gems. 50 taels of silver once. These 2 days the champion has earned a lot of money. Compared to a treasured knife studded with gems, 50 taels of silver was naturally nothing. But if no one could win, then the champion didn't need to pay any cost. 50 taels of silver was enough for a normal person to live for 2 to 3 years. Yili was curious, what arena is so difficult? Yaoji said, archery. Archery? Yili raised her eyebrows in surprise. It seemed that the champion of the northern tribes was very confident in his archery skills. One had to know what kind of place was Riyang now. It was where the Mahist army was stationed. Half of the Mahist army's elite Black Cloud cavalry were stationed outside Riyang City. and all of the Black Cloud cavalry could be said to be 1 in 100 master archers. Yaoji looked outside and suddenly smiled. Wang Fei, are those the young generals of the Mahist army? Yili looked outside and saw that a few young generals had squeezed to the front of the crowd. It was Yun Ting and the young general called Qin Yun who had fought with Yili in the Mahist army camp. It seemed that the two had a good relationship now. Yili stood up and smiled. Let's go and see what's so special about the Northern Tribe's master archers. Chapter 463. Yaoji smiled. Since that is the case, I will join in the fun. Princess, please. The arena was placed on the street opposite the concentrated fragrance court. Yili walked over and saw a dagger embedded with gems in the middle of the arena from afar. If the opponent did not have great confidence in his archery skills, then he must be rich and have no place to spend it. Let's not talk about the dagger, just the hilt and the scabbard were embedded with rubies, sapphires and emeralds. Just the gems on the scabbard were priceless. Qin Feng. Yili said softly. Qin Feng, who was following behind her, came forward and said softly, Princess, what are your orders? Yili looked at the middle-aged man in the Northern Tribe's uniform and said, investigate this person's background. Qin Feng looked at the man on the arena and nodded, yes, Princess. The three of them stood at the back of the crowd. Yun Ting had already jumped onto the arena and looked arrogantly at the Northern Tribesman. Tell me, how do we fight in this arena? The Northern Tribesman sized up Yun Ting and laughed. This young master is so fair and clean. Do you want to fight in the arena? Don't be unable to draw your bow. Our Northern Tribe's bow cannot be compared to your Dechu states. Yun Ting laughed coldly and said, if I don't want to fight, then why am I here? To fight with you? Walking to the place where the bows and arrows were placed, he casually picked up a bow and an arrow. With a backhand, he shot an arrow towards a thick pillar at the side of the ring. With a zing sound, the arrow nailed into the pillar and sank into the wood. The spectators below the stage cheered loudly. The Northern Tribesman also clapped and laughed. Good, I did not expect this young master to be an expert. Since that is the case, let's begin. Yun Ting snorted and looked down at the bow in his hand, ignoring the other party. The Northern Tribesman did not mind and laughed. The rules are simple. This humble one has heard that there is a saying in the Central Plains called sharpshooter from 100 paces. We, the Northern Tribes, do not like those elegant things. Forget about shooting a willow leaf from 100 paces away. Young master, please look over there. Following the direction of his finger, there was a towering tree about 70 to 80 steps away from the arena. At this moment, there were countless threads hanging down from the numbers on the tree, and at the end of each thread was a copper coin. It was already nighttime. Even though the streets were lit up like daytime, it was still not as bright as daytime. If one didn't look carefully, they wouldn't even be able to see the strings that held the coins. The copper coins swayed in the cool breeze, occasionally producing a crisp sound. The man said, there are a total of 30 copper coins on it. As long as young master shoots all of them down, this saber will be young master's. You only have half an incense's time, 10 arrows. In other words, he had to use 10 arrows to shoot down 30 copper coins. Yun Ting. Qin Yun frowned. In terms of archery, he was not inferior to Yun Ting, but to him, it was impossible to shoot down 30 copper coins with 10 arrows. These copper coins were hung at different heights, and it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to shoot down a few of them at the same time. Compared to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away, this was much more difficult. Yun Ting stared at the tree for a while, then snorted and shot an arrow. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the arrow left the bowstring and shot towards the copper coins under the shade of the tree. With a few crisp sounds, one of the copper coins was pierced through the middle. The huge force of the arrow caused the copper coin to shatter into pieces and fall to the ground. The arrow did not stop there and shot through another thread that held the copper coin before piercing into the tree. Good. The spectators below the stage could not help but cheer. To be able to shoot two in such a dark night, his archery skills were definitely not inferior to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away. The man from the Northern Tribes standing on the stage did not show any surprise. Yun Ting and Qin Yun on the stage did not say anything. Those who knew archery understood that the further one shot, the harder it was to shoot. Yun Ting's archery skills were not bad, but he might not be able to shoot all 30 copper coins. Seeing Yun Ting knocked his arrow and aimed again, Everyone's eyes were fixed on the copper coins under the tree. When Yun Ting shot his 7th arrow, there were still 15 copper coins left on the tree. Qin Feng silently appeared behind Yi Li, giving Yi Li a shock. Yi Li turned her head to look at Qin Feng. Qin Feng said in a low voice, "This middle-aged man is indeed from the northern tribes, but he is not an ordinary one. He is a capable general under Helian Jun of the northern tribes. He is also known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes. Furthermore, the Dao that he is using as a prize is not simple. It was given to him by the king of the northern tribes when Helian Jun was still favored. It is said that it can cut through hair with a single blow and is incomparably sharp." "Oh." Yi Li raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "The #1 archer of the northern tribes has come to Ryong to set up a stall?" Qin Feng smiled and said, "Him setting up a stall has nothing to do with the king of the northern tribes. Ever since Helian Jin fell out of favor with the king of the northern tribes, although there were a few factions that wanted to rope him in, they were all rejected by him. He even gave up his original position in the army. Therefore he is now just a commoner. As long as he does not violate the laws of the various countries, no one can control where he sets up his stall." Because the crown prince had just been born, when Ryong City sent out invitations, it had already announced that people from all over the world were welcome to come to the northwest for business or sightseeing. Therefore these days there were many martial arts experts, Jianghu tourists, and even scholars and poets who set up a competition. Of course, there were even more merchants and tourists who came after hearing the news. Yi Li turned her head to look at him and asked with a smile, "So he is one of Yelu Ye's men?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "You can say that." Yi Li laughed coldly, "What a good Yelu Yi, and also the 7th prince of the northern tribes." Yelu Yi clearly knew that Ryong was where the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were stationed, but he still sent someone to cause trouble. Didn't he just want people to know that the archery skills of the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were only SOSO? Seeing Yi Li become angry, Qin Feng asked in a low voice, "Wang Fei, how many people should this subordinate send to deal with him?" Even Qilin did not have many people who could achieve such a demanding archery skill, but fortunately it was not impossible. Right now, among the hundreds of Qilin, there could be 7 or 8 who would accept the challenge. But in his previous life, there might not be anyone in the northern tribes who had the strength of this person in front of him. Otherwise, how could he be the #1 archer of the northern tribes? Yi Li shook her head indifferently, saying, "This kind of trash doesn't need a Qilin to make a move. Maybe Yelu Yi just wants to meet a Qilin? How could a Qilin be someone that anyone could meet whenever they wanted to?" The so-called special forces, no matter what era it was, were synonymous with mystery. If everyone could guess their battle strength, then what was the point of being a secret trump card? "I'm afraid that Officer Yun is going to lose." Qin Feng pointed at Yun Ting, who was preparing to shoot the last arrow. There were still 13 copper coins hanging on the tree. Yun Ting would not be able to shoot all of them down in one shot. Yi Li smiled lightly, "It's a good thing for young people to have some spirit. Losing to the #1 archer of the northern tribes, he is not wronged." Qin Feng nodded. Wang Fei is right. When Yun Ting's last arrow left the bowstring, he actually shot out 3 copper coins at once. Even so, it was clear that Yun Ting had lost this round. The young handsome face was as cold as ice, and there was a trace of depression that was hard to detect. The man from the northern tribes smiled. "This young master, you have lost 50 taels." Yun Ting's face darkened as he took out a 50 taels silver ingot and handed it to the man from the northern tribes. Then he turned and jumped off the stage. Chapter 464. Is there any other expert willing to come up on stage and try? The man put away the ingot and smiled at the audience. "Even the Mahist army cannot do it, who else can win?" Someone in the crowd shouted. Instantly, everyone's eyes focused on Yun Ting. The man on stage smiled and said, "Oh? So this little brother is a soldier of the Mahist army? Sorry for the disrespect. I heard that the Mahist army is made up of 1 in 100 master archers. Is there any other Mahist army soldier willing to come up on stage and try? How about this young master?" He looked down at Qin Yun, who was beside Yun Ting. His voice had a hint of provocation. Qin Yun and Yun Ting's archery skills could be said to be equal. At this time they could neither go up nor stay down. Yun Ting's face darkened. He knew that his pride had implicated Qin Yun. Just as he was about to go up and speak, Qin Yun reached out and pulled him back. Qin Yun thought about it and was about to speak when he heard an elegant voice from behind. Since it is like this, can this consort try? General Huyen of the Northern Tribes? Everyone was stunned. They were all focused on Yun Ting's archery, and because it was night time, Yi Li and Yaoji were standing in an inconspicuous position at the back. Everyone in front of the ring did not notice that there were two beautiful women in the crowd. Hearing Yi Li's words, everyone turned to look at Yi Li. There was even a portion of people looking at the Northern Tribes people on stage. It was understandable that the Northern Tribes people had enmity towards the Dechu state. So no one took the provocation of Qin Yun to heart. But if it was the famous general of the Northern Tribes, the #1 master archer of the Northern Tribes, provoking a nameless Mahist army general, then it was not acceptable. Greetings to Princess. Half of the people in front of the arena were residents of Riyang City. When they saw Yi Li, they hurriedly stepped forward to salute her and made way for her. The others naturally followed suit. Although they were not under the command of the Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion, they were guests and had to show some respect to the host. With his identity exposed, the Northern Tribesman was stunned. He looked at the lady in green who walked out from the crowd. She was beautiful and elegant with a smile on her face. She looked like a lady from a prestigious family in Dechu State. However, that smile made him feel a chill down his spine. She smiled at Yi Li, so it's Princess Ding. This one doesn't quite understand what Princess Consort is talking about, General Huyen? Yi Li smiled faintly and leapt onto the stage under the watchful eyes of the crowd. She said lightly, the former #1 archer of the Northern Tribes, Huyen LV. Although some of the children under this consort's command aren't worth much, for a general to personally instruct them is too much of a waste of talent. Chapter 465. On the stage, Huyen Lu stared at the green-clothed woman in front of him as he tried to hide the shock in his heart. Princess Ding, this is the last arrow. Yi Li smiled and calmly took the arrow. This time she was not in a hurry. Instead she slowly knocked the arrow and took aim. Everyone could not help but hold their breaths as they looked at the few remaining copper plates on the tree. They saw Yi Li suddenly leap forward. She stopped on the table behind her and jumped up. While in the air she quickly drew the bow and shot an arrow. Whoosh! The arrow was nailed into the tree. Everyone stared blankly at the empty tree in front of them. The copper plates hanging from the tree had disappeared without a trace. Those with sharp eyes could see that there were a few strings of the same length hanging from the tree. Princess Ding's last arrow had actually broken a thin thread. How could this kind of archery skills and eyesight not shock people? Yi Li turned to look at the pale Huyen Lu and smiled faintly. The same rules. If General Huyen can stand aside, then this consort will lose. The crowd was in an uproar. Previously it was Huyen Lu who had set up the stage to challenge everyone. Now the situation was reversed. Princess Ding was challenging Huyen Lu, the #1 expert of the Northern Tribes. The crowd below the stage was discussing. Yun Ting, who had a cold face, was now very excited. How is it, General Huyen? Don't tell me you don't dare to accept our consort's challenge? Huyen Lu's face was ashen. He did not dare. Huyen Lu was known as the #1 expert of the Northern Tribes. He naturally had real skills. If he had more time he might have been able to do what Yi Li had just done. But now he was powerless. He could shoot one arrow at a time and guarantee that he could shoot down all the copper coins within 10 arrows. But he could not control 3 arrows to shoot down 7 or 8 copper coins at the same time. And Yi Li clearly knew this. That was why she had given him such a difficult problem. General Huyen? Yi Li reminded with a smile. This one concedes. Huyen Lu gritted his teeth and said. When he raised his head he was immediately booed. Yi Li walked to the center of the ring and picked up the gem-studded dagger that was placed on the shelf and pulled it out. A gust of cold air immediately rushed out. The bright blade was so shiny that it could reflect one's reflection. The sharp and cold blade showed that this blade had drunk countless amounts of blood. Yi Li casually waved her hand, and the table in front of her immediately shattered. Yi Li returned the saber to its scabbard and praised, "It really is a good saber. Many thanks to General Huyen." Seeing Yi Li put away the treasured saber in her sleeve, Huyen Lu's complexion turned ashen, but he had nothing to say. He could only look on helplessly as Yi Li walked down the stage with the treasured saber that he was so proud of. Yi Li took the Howling Moon saber and jumped down the stage. Yun Ting immediately rushed up and greedily said, "Princess, can this subordinate take a look at the treasured saber that you won?" That was a famous treasured saber of the northern tribes. There were many swordsmiths in Dechu State and there were many famous treasured swords. But the craftsmanship of the saber was not as good as that of the western tomb and the northern tribes. Especially since the northern tribes were good at using sabers. The sabers that they made were all top quality, not to mention the famous Howling Moon saber. Yi Li glanced at him with a smile that was not a smile. Yun Ting suddenly remembered the trouble that he had caused before. The excitement on his face immediately turned to depression and fear. After appreciating his depressed appearance, Yi Li smiled and threw the treasured saber into his hands. Yun Ting hurriedly thanked her. He held the arrow in his hand and studied it carefully. His fondness for it was evident in his words. "Your Highness's archery is truly marvelous. This subordinate is extremely impressed," Qin Yun said sincerely as he followed beside Yi Li. Ever since the martial arts competition last year, Qin Yun had been full of admiration for this young Wang Fei. After today's scene, it was even more convincing. Yi Li smiled and said, "How is it as mysterious as you say it is? I just put in a little more effort than usual. On the battlefield, there is no need for everyone to shoot copper coins from trees in the middle of the night. You are killing enemies on the battlefield, not performing in the arena." Qin Yun smiled but did not speak. He understood that the princess was comforting him. He only decided that when he returned he would work even harder to practice his archery skills. Qin Yun and Yun Ting lived in the military camp and were not going the same way as Yi Li. When they parted, Yun Ting could only reluctantly return the treasured saber to Yi Li. Looking at his eager appearance, Yi Li smiled faintly and threw the saber back into his hands, saying, "If you like it, then take it." Yun Ting stilled and was overjoyed. At the side, Qin Yun helplessly rolled his eyes at him. With his pitiful and reluctant appearance, those who did not know would think that the one that Wang Fei was taking away was not a saber but his beloved. He knew that Wang Fei was very tolerant of the people around her, so he did not stop Yun Ting from being foolish. When Yun Ting reacted, he carefully held the saber and asked in a daze, "Wang Fei is really giving it to me?" Yi Li smiled and said, "I didn't come for his saber. It was just a coincidence. Even more, there is no one in Wang Fei who likes to use this kind of saber. Since you like it so much, you can keep it." Compared to this kind of curved sword, Yi Li preferred light and straight daggers and military knives. Even more, the beautiful gems and decorations on the scabbard were not suitable to be carried around as a weapon. When Yi Li gave an affirmative reply, Yun Ting stupidly held the saber. He looked as though he wanted to put the saber in his mouth and take a bite to see if it was real. Qin Yun, who was standing beside him, couldn't help but secretly take a step back, embarrassed to walk with him. Yi Li looked at Qin Yun and said with a smile, "Ben Fei remembers that Field Officer Qin uses a spear and needs a close combat weapon to protect yourself. I just recently received a cold rhino blade. Later I will have someone send it to you to see if it suits you." Qin Yun was overjoyed. The scabbard of the cold rhino blade was not as beautiful as the Howling Moon in Yun Ting's hands, but the blade was not any worse, because they had been forged by the same master. And it was more practical than the Howling Moon blade. Because the Howling Moon had been obtained by the royal house of the northern tribes, it had been decorated so beautifully that it was not suitable for the battlefield. The cold rhino blade had always maintained the original simplicity and sharpness of the blacksmith. "This subordinate thanks Wang Fei." Yi Li waved her hand and said with a smile, "No need. It is a good thing that a good weapon can find a good owner. Ben Fei will go first. It is rare for me to have some free time. You guys can play. Farewell, Wang Fei." The place where Yi Li and the others were speaking was only a dozen steps away from the stage. Yi Li's careless action of tossing the Howling Moon saber to Yun Ting was naturally seen by many people. The common people naturally thought that Princess Ding treated her subordinates well and was benevolent. But the people involved all had dark expressions. In Ningxiang Pavilion, Yelu Yi and Mo Jingli both stared at the graceful figure walking away amidst the crowd. A trace of gloom and anger flashed across Yelu Ye's eyes. Yi Li had exposed Huyen Lu's true identity in front of everyone. But after winning the Howling Moon blade, she had carelessly given it to a lowly military officer. This was clearly looking down on the royal house of the northern tribes and him, Yelu Yi. Yi Lu Yi, who had always been arrogant, was once again rebuffed by Yi Li. How could he swallow this anger? Yellow Yi stood up and wanted to jump down from the window to chase after the figure that was gradually blending into the crowd. But he suddenly felt a cold gaze shoot towards him with undisguised killing intent. Following the direction of his gaze, he saw a man with snow-white hair staring at him with a cold expression through an open window on the opposite street corner. Yellow Yi's heart jumped. He suppressed the chill in his heart and slowly sat down. Mo Shuyao watched him sit back down. His lips hooked in a cold smile as he raised the wine cup in his hand. Yellow Yi gave a cold snort. He raised the wine cup in front of him and drained it in one gulp.